What are you doing? Stop it!
My son Michael shook off my arm and ran into the yard. In the yard, there were several fist-sized stones scattered around, thrown by my mother-in-law Sarah out of spite. They had piled up in the corner of the yard like a small mountain, making it difficult to deal with. To a hungry Michael, I wondered what those stones looked like. He picked one up and was about to put it in his mouth. Panicking, I staggered to my feet to stop him. I hadn't eaten properly in days, so I was weak. I had no husband. He had passed away in a car accident, and since then, I had no income and lived in poverty. Even if I wanted to work, my frail body couldn't handle a regular job. But now, Michael's well-being was more important than mine. I had to hurry, or Michael would eat the stone. I cursed my own helplessness. It was my fault that Michael was so hungry that he was about to eat a stone. It was my fault. I felt inadequate as a mom. Overwhelmed with guilt, frustration, and sadness, tears flowed uncontrollably.
Stop, please! Please stop!
I desperately grabbed his hand. But to my shock, Michael's eyes sparkled as he happily ate the stone.
Mom, this is delicious.
I couldn't believe my eyes. My name is Jennifer. I live with my young son Michael.
Mom, look! A dandelion.
Michael smiled happily, pointing to a dandelion blooming in the park. Michael turned 4 this year, and he would soon be starting preschool. I dreaded it. There were fees for enrollment, supplies needed for preschool, and other various expenses, but I had no income. Normally, people would work, but my weak body made it difficult for me to do so. Besides, there was no one to watch Michael while I worked. As I watched Michael play on the park slide, I wondered what I should do. My husband Joseph had died in a car accident last year. I remember it clearly, just like today, with the sun shining down. We were out shopping as a family, with Michael in a stroller. After finishing our shopping, we walked a bit and reached a crosswalk. The light turned green, and as we were crossing, a car came speeding towards us.
Get out of the way!
He pushed me and the stroller with Michael out of the way. The car screeched to a halt, and the scene quickly became chaotic. Someone called an ambulance, and Joseph, who was unconscious, was rushed away with sirens blaring. I waited, praying, but he never came back to us. The police investigation revealed that the driver had run a red light. Michael probably didn't understand that his dad was gone. His eyes looking up at me made my heart ache. I have to raise Michael properly. I swore to myself as I looked at Joseph's photo. But the reality was that we were barely getting by on the money Joseph had saved. I had considered applying for welfare, but because we had savings and owned a home, I was turned down. The caseworker.
You're still young and able to work, so stop relying on others,
coldly told me. Sarah, my mother-in-law, had been hostile towards me since Joseph's death.
This happened because you were daydreaming.
Other relatives sided with me, saying it was clearly the fault of the driver who ignored the traffic light. But Sarah blamed me and Michael, as Joseph had died protecting us, making us the villains in her eyes. I couldn't deny that thought either. I kept thinking if only I had checked for safety more thoroughly or spent a little longer shopping. Sometimes I even regretted going out that day.
Apologize to Joseph.
I'm sorry. I am truly sorry. For several months after Joseph died, she came every month on the anniversary of his death, demanding apologies from Michael and me. But after half a year, she started throwing stones at us.
I hate you!
She would scream and throw stones from her house. Our house was next to Sarah's, and she would throw fist-sized stones from her yard. When I went outside to ask her to stop, she threw more stones. Some of them were aimed directly at me, and if I didn't dodge, they'd hit my face or body.
Sarah, stop it! It hurts!
Instinctively, I raised my hand to protect my face, and a sharp pain shot through me. A stone hit the back of my hand, and it started to bleed a little. I looked around. What if it had hit Michael? But fortunately, he wasn't playing outside today. Relieved, I sighed deeply. The stone throwing had stopped, and there were various sizes of stones scattered in the yard. Michael and I picked them up one by one and piled them where they wouldn't be in the way. Before we knew it, the pile of stones was as tall as Michael. "This is a problem," I muttered while looking at the pile of stones. These days, I was down to 2 meals a day to save money, trying to ignore my growling stomach. I had to find a way out of this poverty. If I could get even a small income, I could save some money. Checking the dwindling balance of my bank account, I hoped it would ease my anxiety a bit. Another problem was Sarah. For some reason, she kept throwing stones at us. Always near the end of the month. Obviously, she hated us, but it was excessive. Michael hadn't been hit yet, but who knows when he might get hurt. I wanted her to stop, but going to talk to her only made her throw more stones. She wouldn't listen to me. Going out to face her was like becoming a target on purpose.
If only there was someone to mediate.
One day, while I was thinking about this, Michael said,
"Hey, what about Thomas?" "Thomas? Who's that?" "Thomas, we found an elephant by the river together,"
Michael said, but I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought it must be an imaginary friend. Children's imagination is so endearing, I thought, and I ignored it. But a few days later, I remembered Joseph's friend, Thomas. A few months before Joseph died, we had gone to the zoo together. Thomas loved children and had given Michael a piggyback ride while they chatted in the elephant area. There was a small water area for the elephants to drink from, and Michael had called it a river. Michael's words, not knowing the difference between a river and a water trough, had made us all laugh.
"That's it, maybe I should consult Thomas."
I felt hesitant to ask, but I had no one else to turn to. Summoning my courage, I sent him a text. A few weeks later, Michael, Thomas, and I met at a restaurant. It was the first time I had seen Thomas since Joseph's funeral. I was surprised. "I never expected to hear from you, Jennifer." He was dressed in white pants and a black shirt, smiling as he spoke. The last time we met, his hair was straight, but today it was permed.
"Thank you for taking the time to meet me."
"No problem." "Michael, order whatever you like."
"Really? Then I'll have this, and this."
He opened the menu on the table and pointed at various items without much thought. Thomas chuckled. "How about this one?" and suggested. He pointed to a large parfait with brownies, chocolate ice cream, whipped cream, and lots of chocolate syrup, which made Michael's eyes light up.
"Oh, I want this."
"Wait, Michael, stop it." I hurriedly tried to stop him, but Thomas had already placed the order. "It's okay, I'll pay for it." I felt overwhelmed with embarrassment and wished I could disappear. As we chatted about recent events, the chocolate parfait was brought to Michael. After receiving it, Thomas looked at me and said,
"So, you have something you want to discuss?"
His slightly guarded posture made me feel a bit uneasy, but I started talking about Sarah. Meanwhile, Michael was eating the parfait, getting chocolate all around his mouth. When I finished, Thomas looked thoughtful. "I see, that is indeed puzzling."
"I really want to know how to make her stop. Can you help me?" "I do know Joseph's mom, but I'm not sure."
His reluctant expression was as expected. After all, no one wants to get involved in someone else's family issues. If things went wrong, he could get caught up in it too. But I couldn't back down now.
I have no one else to turn to. Please help me.
Thomas folded his arms in thought for a moment. Then, Michael, holding a spoon,
Please,
said. He probably didn't understand the situation, just imitating me. But he looked at Thomas with a serious expression. After a moment of silence, Thomas started laughing. Michael, you look a lot like Joseph. I was taken aback by the sudden remark.
Well, people often say that.
Seeing Michael reminded me of how Joseph helped me once. Thomas recounted a time when he and Joseph worked at the same company and a big deal went wrong. Thomas had planned to resign and report to his boss. But to his surprise, his boss already knew about it and didn't think it was Thomas's fault. I found out later that Joseph had stood up for me. Joseph had good performance and was close to the boss, so there was no problem. He was a kind person to everyone. I still haven't repaid that kindness. Thomas looked at me with a determined expression. Jennifer, to repay Michael, I will help you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
No thanks needed. Thomas didn't live near us, so he agreed to check in occasionally. He also wanted to visit on the monthly anniversary to see how Sarah was doing. We planned to confront her if needed. Since then, I occasionally saw Thomas walking around our neighborhood. For some reason, he wore a black hat and sunglasses, looking a bit suspicious. I thought it might be better to stop, but since he seemed so serious, I left it unsaid. A week had passed since Thomas started investigating, but there was no progress. On the contrary, Thomas said Sarah didn't even seem to notice his presence. Sarah always left early in the morning, returned briefly during the day, and then went out again. She came home at 9 p.m., and the lights went out shortly after. I'll keep watching for a while longer. Wearing his usual black hat, he seemed enthusiastic. However, after a few weeks, there was no contact from him.
What's happened to Thomas?
During that time, I looked for jobs with daycare or browsed brochures for vocational training. But none of them seemed doable for me, and I could only sigh. I managed to scrape by selling baby clothes, miscellaneous items, and picture books on local buy and sell groups. Even so, my bank account balance kept decreasing and life got tougher. Eventually, I reduced myself to 1 meal a day, and Michael to 2. Even those meals were quite small, so Michael always asked for snacks.
Mom, can I have some candy?
I'm sorry, we don't have any candy. I always apologized, as we couldn't afford to buy any. We went to the park to distract ourselves from hunger. But without proper meals, we quickly grew tired and had to return home. We started going out less and less. I'm hungry, Mom. In the dimly lit room in the evening, Michael murmured. He had already eaten lunch, so there was nothing left for dinner. With no money, I couldn't go grocery shopping either. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I hugged Michael tightly. All I could do was apologize. At that moment, Michael broke free from my arms and ran into the yard.
No! I'm hungry!
For some reason, he picked up a stone and put it in his mouth.
What are you doing? Stop it!
I hurried to stop him, feeling dizzy from lack of food. Having not eaten properly for days, I had no strength, but I had to act quickly to prevent Michael from eating the stone. I cursed my own helplessness. I had let Michael get so hungry that he was trying to eat a stone. It was my fault. I was failing as a mom. Overwhelmed with guilt, regret, and sadness, I couldn't stop crying.
Please, stop it, Michael! Please stop!
I desperately grabbed his hand, but I saw something unbelievable. Michael was eating the stone as if it were delicious.
Mom, this is chocolate. It's really good.
Looking closer, all the stones were actually made of chocolate, crafted to look like real stones. I picked up one and took a bite. It was indeed chocolate. I checked the pile of stones in the corner of the yard and found they were all chocolate.
This is unbelievable.
It's like something out of a fairy tale, having a yard full of edible stones. Michael kept reaching for more, getting chocolate all over his mouth. I went back inside to get a basket. No matter what, I couldn't let the neighbors see us eating stones in the yard. Michael and I filled the basket with chocolate stones and decided to eat inside.
Still, what on earth is going on?
It was hard to believe Sarah had been throwing chocolate. Could there be poison in them? I wondered with a sinking feeling. But so far, both Michael and I felt fine. While thinking, my mobile phone suddenly rang. It was Thomas. I quickly grabbed my mobile phone and answered.
Hello, Thomas. It's terrible. The stone is chocolate, and Michael is eating it, and then...
I ended up speaking rapidly, but Thomas remained calm. Calm down. I understand the situation.
What do you mean?
Let me explain step by step. Sarah, actually. When I listened to Thomas's story in detail, it was as follows. Sarah was working 2 part-time jobs every day, from early morning until late at night. She would finish her morning job and come home around noon. Then, after having lunch and changing clothes, she would work at a call center in the afternoon, returning home at 9 p.m. She has been living this way for a year now. I was surprised that Sarah was as tough as Joseph. Being able to handle 2 jobs without breaking down means she is blessed with good health.
But why is Sarah working part-time jobs?
I asked her that too.
You talked to her directly?
No, actually, she noticed me while I was tailing her. Although I couldn't see his face over the phone, I could tell from his voice that he was giving a wry smile. If a man in a black hat and sunglasses was following me, I would think he was suspicious too. It wasn't surprising that she noticed, so I wasn't that shocked. Sarah apparently caught Thomas, who was following her to her workplace, by waiting for him instead. I was amazed by her guts, but even more so by the fact that she questioned Thomas further. Thomas managed to evade Sarah's questions while gathering recent information from her. I decided to talk to Sarah at a cafe near her workplace. After entering the cafe, he began.
Why are you working 2 jobs? It doesn't look like you're struggling financially.
At that time, Sarah was dressed nicely, wearing makeup, and her hair was well-groomed. Sarah replied in a murmured voice. It's not for myself. I can manage my own life.
Then why?
Sarah hesitated to answer that question. After a while, she said reluctantly, It's for Jennifer. She can't work because of her health, so I'm working instead of her. Apparently, Sarah has been working and even opened a bank account to save money for us. Thomas was surprised by her answer.
What, for a year? Does Jennifer know about this?
Probably not. But Michael will need more money from now on, right? I just want to help a little. It was hard to believe that she would say such a thing. However, the story still didn't connect. Throwing stone-like chocolates seemed unrelated to her motive. I urged him to continue. Thomas, thinking the same, asked her hesitantly.
But, according to Jennifer, you have been throwing stones into the house.
When he said that, Sarah looked sad. She apologized and said, I feel bad for her. But it can't be helped.
What do you mean?
It's sadness. I don't know where to direct the sadness of losing Joseph.
So, are you treating Jennifer coldly and throwing stones to distract from your sadness?
Sarah replied, Yes. His words. According to Thomas, it seemed she hadn't accepted Joseph's death. Indeed, as a mom, the grief of losing a beloved son is unimaginable. I can't help but feel my heart break at the thought of Michael passing away before me.
Joseph chose her, so how could I not love the woman he loved?
However, she couldn't let go of the belief that it wasn't the driver who took Joseph's life, but her.
I'm stubborn about strange things. So, the main reason for throwing stones at them was hate, wasn't it?
Hate?
Of course, that's part of it. But I didn't throw stones. Those were just chocolates,
she said coldly. Since Joseph passed away, Sarah noticed that Michael and I were visibly losing weight. So, Sarah bought chocolates that looked like stones and kept throwing them at us. The reason she did it towards the end of the month was simply because payday was near.
I feel both hate and love for Jennifer and Michael. It's complicated.
In the end, Sarah muttered sadly. That day, I left the shop after that. That's all I heard.
I see. Thank you very much.
I was still filled with disbelief. Sarah seemed to show hatred towards Michael and me, but deep down, she couldn't hate us completely. There's a word for this, love-hate. It might be that hating and loving are two sides of the same coin. Ironically, those feelings manifested in throwing chocolates at us. I looked at Michael, who was eating chocolate right next to me. The basket that had been full was now half empty. It became clear that Sarah hated and resented us, but at the same time, she gave us chocolates out of goodwill. However, I was confused about whether it was right to continue such a complicated relationship. Couldn't we somehow repair this relationship?
It's not really my place to say this.
Thomas took a breath and said, How about we arrange a meeting for Jennifer and Sarah to reconcile? I was genuinely surprised and felt apologetic.
No, really. This is our problem.
But it hasn't worked out so far, has it? Maybe it will change if someone mediates.
But
we're already involved. Leave it to me. Thanks to Thomas, Sarah and I met a few days later. The place was our usual restaurant. At first, there was an awkward atmosphere, and neither Sarah nor I could make eye contact.
Thomas told me everything.
When I said that, Sarah seemed to understand everything in that one sentence.
I see.
And replied without looking at me.
Joseph isn't coming back. I understand that you're sad.
Do you?
But wouldn't Joseph be sad if we were still at odds?
Sarah was surprised by my words. Until then, she hadn't made eye contact, but now she was looking straight at me.
Sarah, let's end this complicated relationship.
I looked back firmly, appealing to her. Neither of us said anything for a while, but finally, Sarah relaxed and said,
Yes, I was thinking the same thing.
Sarah bowed deeply and apologized for everything that had happened.
I'm sorry for being so harsh. I won't do it again.
And so, Sarah and I reconciled. Naturally, I was very happy and filled with joy. It's not just that I no longer have to worry about being pelted with stones or shouted at. There is a glimmer of hope that, while it may not be the same as before, I can rebuild my relationship with Sarah. Today marks about half a year since then. My relationship with Sarah has significantly improved. Of course, there are no more piles of chocolate in the yard. Around that time, I was given the opportunity to work as a housekeeper. After that discussion, Thomas approached me. We have an opening for a housekeeper. Would you be interested? He said. My new business is taking off, and I've been neglecting household chores. Naturally, you will be compensated.
Well, I can handle household chores, I replied.
You don't have to come every day. You can work around your health, maybe 3 days a week. Having been ill for a long time and only having done housework as a housewife, I was confident in my ability to handle household chores. Since he mentioned I could work around my health, I decided to take the job. His house was so large it could be called a mansion, and there were 2 other housekeepers besides me. It turned out that my skills were superior to the others, and they praised me highly. Following their recommendation, I registered with a housekeeper dispatch agency and took on jobs within my limits, where I was also highly evaluated. People appreciated my pre-made dishes and how I organized the living room storage to make it easier to use. I started getting more requests, but since I was also working for Thomas, my availability was limited. Additionally, I had to consider my health, making it difficult to work regularly. Due to this, I was known as a unique person. Before I knew it, I had become a legendary housekeeper. Thomas was also pleased, saying he could focus more on his work than ever before. He mentioned that the bookshelf I organized was easier to view and the information more accessible. When my abilities were praised like this, it made me happy but also a bit embarrassed. My work became steady, and I was able to earn a stable income. Thanks to this, I could provide Michael with delicious meals. Naturally, I also had more opportunities to invite Sarah over for meals. Because of this, Michael has become very attached to Grandma lately.
Grandma, look. It's a car,
he said, holding a toy car Sarah had bought for him a while ago, playing together with me. Sarah,
I don't understand,
she said, narrowing her eyes happily as she watched Michael. I wonder if Joseph is watching us from heaven. I believe that he is surely watching this happy scene with a smile.
I heard about it. Isn't it great? I heard you bought a new house. We want to live together too. From what I heard, it's a detached house with a vegetable garden and yard.
My son, Tanner, and his family showed up out of nowhere, saying they had caught wind of the situation.
You know, it's customary for parents to live with their oldest son,
Tanner declared matter-of-factly. His wife Maria chimed in.
We're moving here as well. If you refuse, don't expect us to take care of you when you're old,
Tanner threatened, completely disregarding our feelings on the matter before leaving abruptly. The plan worked out perfectly, didn't it? My daughter, Michelle, laughed, but with a hint of sadness in her eyes.
Yes, I can't wait for moving day,
I replied, trying to stay positive despite the circumstances. On the day of the move, after the initial flurry of activity had settled, I turned on my phone to find numerous missed calls from Tanner.
Mom, where are you now? What the hell is this? The place hasn't been renovated at all,
he yelled, his voice filled with indignation. Oh, but I did have it thoroughly cleaned, you know. Michelle helped out too, and it was quite the task. From now on, you'll have to keep it tidy yourselves, I explained calmly. When Tanner and his family, who had so forcefully insisted on moving in together, finally arrived at their new residence, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. My name is Michaela Thompson, and I'm 62 years old. Currently, I live alone on my widow's pension. My husband Andrew, who was 3 years my senior, passed away from illness last year at the young age of 64. Due to Andrew's frequent job transfers, I decided to quit my own job upon getting married to follow him wherever he was assigned. We were blessed with our eldest son Tanner and daughter Michelle while on assignment, but after giving birth to Michelle, my health took a serious turn for the worse. I found myself unable to accompany Andrew to his next posting. The destination was overseas, you see. With no siblings and my parents long gone, I had no one to turn to for support. That's when I made the decision to move in with my in-laws. My father-in-law Gordon and mother-in-law Fiona were incredibly kind people who had treated me like their own daughter ever since I married into the family. Assured by their warmth, I accepted their offer to live together. However, no matter how lovely people may be, actually sharing a home can be quite different from what one imagines. Through my experience living with my in-laws, I would come to learn this lesson all too well. Gordon and Fiona doted on Tanner excessively.
Tanner is the heir to the Thompson family name.
Perhaps it was because his grandparents showered him with such praise, but his arrogant behavior gradually became more and more noticeable.
I'm the successor of the Thompson family, so I'm in a different league than the rest of you,
he would boast. When I first moved in with my in-laws, separated from Andrew, Tanner was only 5 years old, just a preschooler. Yet this child began belittling his friends and pushing his responsibilities onto others. After receiving a complaint from his preschool teacher, I decided to have a talk with him.
Tanner, why would you say such things to your friends?
I asked gently.
Because I'm different from other people. I have to teach those who don't understand that, don't I?
He retorted defiantly. His response left me utterly shocked.
How on earth did you start thinking that way? Tanner, you're the same as your friends. If you keep saying things like that, they won't like you anymore.
I tried to reason with him.
I'm special, that's why. Grandpa and Grandma said so. They told me I'm smart and great.
Tanner yelled before bursting into tears. He tore away from my grasp and ran off to Gordon and Fiona's room. I was left standing there, dumbfounded. Did my in-laws really say such things to Tanner? Sure, they doted on him a lot. Sometimes I thought they went overboard, but I brushed it off, thinking it was understandable for grandparents who were thrilled to be living with their grandson. However, I would soon learn that my perspective was far too lenient.
Michaela, I heard you scolded Tanner quite harshly.
Fiona confronted me one day. That afternoon, when I went to pick Tanner up from the school bus, the teacher asked to have a word with me. Apparently, Tanner had hit one of his classmates. While everyone was lining up and waiting for their turn to use the playground equipment, Tanner had cut in line. When a friend called him out on it, they got into an argument, and Tanner ended up hitting the other child. I listened to Tanner's side of the story and, confirming it was true, scolded him for his actions. But he threw a tantrum and hurled his preschool bag at me. That's when I grabbed his arm and reprimanded him more sternly.
Tanner, all your preschool friends are equal. It's not okay for you to skip the line. And no matter what, you shouldn't hit your friends. Do you understand?
I explained firmly.
I'm special, so why do I have to line up like everyone else?
He shouted, shaking off my hand, ran out of the room, crying. Just then, Gordon and Fiona entered with serious expressions on their faces and said something outrageous.
We heard his side of the story. Grabbing a preschooler's arm so forcefully, doesn't that count as abuse?
Fiona accused. I was taken aback by her words, but I figured she must have only listened to his one-sided explanation. With that in mind, I recounted everything that had transpired from the beginning.
That's why I scolded Tanner and tried to make him understand. I may have held his arm firmly then, but I certainly wasn't abusing him.
I clarified.
Oh, so that's what happened. But maybe there's a part of it that couldn't be helped.
Fiona backpedaled slightly.
Yeah, it's understandable.
Gordon chimed in. At first, I thought they were referring to me scolding Tanner too harshly, but their next words revealed that wasn't the case at all. He is truly bright and more remarkable than other children.
It's only natural for him to think he deserves that kind of treatment.
Fiona reasoned.
Agreed. If anything, he should be given special privileges to that extent.
Gordon added. My in-laws were actually condoning his attitude towards the other children. Realizing this sent a shiver of fear down my spine.
I'm sorry, but I don't think that's good for him,
I said, trying to keep my voice steady. If I didn't have a proper talk with them now, things could get out of hand in the future. I want him to have a little more empathy for others, I explained.
But he is such a smart boy, isn't he?
Fiona countered. That's right. He's only in preschool, but he can already read and do math. Gordon added. It was true. Tanner had started reading picture books on his own without being taught, and he would even read to older kids in the neighborhood. It was a mystery how he learned it all. He probably picked up the letters from TV and building blocks, but he also had an excellent memory and could remember things he heard instantly.
That child is a genius,
Fiona gushed. Indeed.
As his parents, it's our duty to give him a special education from now on.
Gordon agreed. They beamed with pride at his brilliance. I wrote a detailed letter to Andrew about the current situation. I wasn't confident I could explain it well enough with just our usual phone calls and messages, and writing calmly helped me sort out my own feelings. He replied with an apology and asked me to endure it somehow until he could come home for a visit. In response to his words, I patiently tried to reason with Tanner and convey to my in-laws what I wanted them to stop doing. But the more I spoke up, the more displeased they seemed.
Michaela is too hard on Tanner,
Fiona complained.
That boy is truly exceptional. He takes after Andrew and is bound to become an amazing adult.
Gordon chimed in. It was true that Andrew was considered an elite. I knew his frequent transfers were because of his potential. I had heard that in his company, it was common for overseas branch managers to be on the executive track at headquarters. And my in-laws started making more snide remarks to me about that too.
If only Michaela could have kept up with him. Of all things, to have her health fail after giving birth.
Fiona sighed. Indeed.
If she hadn't had Michelle, he would be attending school abroad by now.
Gordon added. They were even implying that Michelle's birth was a mistake. I could handle them saying things about me. I could ignore most of it and argue back if necessary. But I couldn't stand them talking about her, who had only just been born, in that way.
Both Michelle and Tanner are my precious children. And it was Andrew who decided to go alone, so please don't say such things to the kids,
I retorted, my voice a little sharper than intended. My in-laws seemed to take offense at my tone, and their attitudes became even more blatant.
Tanner, why don't you come eat something delicious with Grandma? It looks like Mom can't play with you because she has to take care of Michelle,
Fiona cooed. Mom's health got bad when she had Michelle. She can't give you all her attention like she did when it was just you, Tanner, Gordon added. They kept filling his head with these ideas and continued to spoil him with special treatment. With my in-laws constantly praising him and speaking ill of Michelle and me, Tanner's gaze grew colder towards me. I repeatedly asked my in-laws to stop and told them that I cared about Tanner just as much as Michelle, but he had already stopped accepting those words.
Mom only needs Michelle, right? I'm the heir to the Thompson family and an important person, so why don't you cherish me more?
He demanded. Influenced by his grandparents, Tanner had become thoroughly convinced that he was the Thompson family heir. But even as an heir, the Thompson family wasn't all that distinguished. Gordon was the third son to begin with 2 older brothers. The family's assets consisted of a house, some land, and a gravesite. Even the eldest son was an ordinary office worker, not the type to put pressure on the main family. I heard that while the eldest and second sons had graduated from university, Gordon had failed his entrance exams. His parents told him they couldn't afford to let him be a Ronin, so he got a job right out of high school. I sensed that he had a bit of an inferiority complex towards his brothers because of this. So, when the brilliant Andrew graduated from a top university and landed a job at a top-tier company, it seemed like Gordon had finally gotten his revenge on his brothers. I had heard stories like that. I had also graduated from a university considered prestigious, so I suppose that's why they had treated me well up until now. But now, I had become an enemy in the eyes of my in-laws and Tanner. I wanted to take Tanner and Michelle and leave if possible, but my recovery was slow, and I wasn't even in a state where I could freely take care of myself. With no other choice, I tried to avoid causing disputes as much as possible and simply prayed for my health to improve while waiting for Andrew to return. About a year later, Andrew finally came home for a short visit. It was for various procedures and health checkups. Andrew wasn't on vacation, so he had a lot to take care of. But in between his trips to the company, he came to understand the current situation well. Andrew's overseas assignment would continue for at least another 3 years. Fortunately, my health had stabilized over the year, and he proposed that we go as a family this time. It seemed that even in Andrew's eyes, my in-laws' words and actions towards Tanner were problematic. At first, both my in-laws and Tanner were against it, but he spoke to them about the importance of being exposed to foreign environments from a young age. And so, our family safely left my in-laws and set off overseas. The overseas posting lasted for 5 years, during which time Tanner seemed to have calmed down completely, and the overbearing behavior he had displayed at his grandparents' house was no longer seen. I think it was a good experience for us. When we returned to the States, Tanner was in 6th grade and Michelle in 1st grade. However, after our return, a situation arose where we had to live with my in-laws again. My in-laws' house was a rental, but the landlord demanded they vacate, forcing them to move out. Just as our return was decided, they managed to convince the landlord to wait until then. My in-laws had grown quite old, and they were worried about continuing to live on their own, so we decided to buy a house near Andrew's company headquarters and live together. From now on, even if there were transfers, they would likely be within the country, and in that case, Andrew would go alone. That was the conclusion we reached. I thought Tanner was no longer young like he was back then, so he wouldn't be influenced by his grandparents, and they wouldn't do such things anymore. But I was too naive. As expected, my in-laws treated Tanner special, and Tanner, as if remembering those days, accepted it as if it were only natural. We couldn't kick out my elderly in-laws, and both Andrew and I did everything we could, but Tanner had grown up to be exactly the kind of person his grandparents wanted. My in-laws passed away in quick succession before the children became adults, but the negative legacy they left behind was significant. As his grandparents had hoped, he attended top schools and companies, paving his way to becoming an elite. But as he grew older, his bad personality became even more prominent, and eventually, he began to speak ill of his own father, Andrew. There was only one reason. He had entered a better university and a better company than his dad. I was always told by Grandpa and Grandma that I was better than Dad. Mom only paid attention to Michelle and neglected me, so it's thanks to them that I am who I am today. Tanner reminisced about his grandparents and mocked us, his parents. And he treated his sister Michelle like she was a bug. You were spoiled by Mom growing up. In the future, you'll probably end up going to some bottom-tier university, having a shotgun wedding at some point, and barely scraping by living with some low-class guy, he sneered. He didn't lay a hand on her, but he repeatedly berated Michelle with these words. Andrew tried to subtly admonish Tanner, but now that Tanner believed he was superior to Andrew, there was no way he would listen. The atmosphere in the house was constantly hostile, and I sighed, wondering if family life was always meant to be this bleak. At this rate, it wouldn't be good for her either. I was thinking of encouraging him to move out when an unexpected turning point arrived. Tanner announced that he was getting married. His partner was a woman named Maria, 2 years younger than him. I heard that her father was a department head at a well-known trading company. At the time, Andrew was also a sales department head at a company of the same caliber. Tanner himself was satisfied, and indeed, in terms of social compatibility, she was a good match. Honestly, she was such a shoddy person that it was hard to believe she was the daughter of a respectable father. She was a pretty girl on the outside, but on the inside, she was a spoiled, selfish daughter through and through. She had never worked a day in her life, and of course, her grades in school weren't good either, from what I heard. She somehow managed to graduate from a prestigious girls' school thanks to donations and had apparently been playing at home all this time under the guise of helping with housework. Still, as long as she got along with Tanner and the focus wasn't on us, I decided to turn a blind eye. No matter what form a marriage takes, as long as both parties are satisfied, that's fine. If Tanner was content with that, there was no need for us to say anything. As long as it didn't affect us, Andrew, Michelle, and I all felt the same way. After returning to the US, we finally had a peaceful home life for the first time. The tranquility lasted for a while, and during that time, Michelle got married too. I went from living with Andrew, just the two of us, to being alone. Andrew had passed away. He was only 64. In this day and age, that was still too young to depart from this world. At his funeral, I came face to face with Tanner and his family, whom I had grown distant from, for the first time in a long while. They say a person's inner self is reflected in their outer appearance, and Tanner and Maria embodied that notion, their expressions turning nasty. Now Mom's all alone. She'll have no choice but to rely on us. Tanner sneered. That's right. She's getting on in years, and from here on out, she'll only grow weaker. I wonder what she plans to do all by herself. Maria added. But even if she comes to us for help now, well, these things are determined by the relationships built up until this point. We don't have that kind of bond, do we? Tanner brought up a past incident between us. Tanner, she just lost Dad. Can't you offer her some kinder words? Michelle interjected. Shut up! This has nothing to do with you. This is between Mom and us. Stay out of it! Tanner snapped. That's right. When we asked Michaela for help, she was so cold to us. You have no idea how much that hurt. Maria chimed in. I hate Grandma. Walter, Tanner's spitting image of a grandson, continued with a scowl. Despite barely ever meeting us, they must have fed him so many lies about us that he glared at us as if we were his enemies. The first thing Walter did when he saw Michelle's daughter Mary for the first time this morning was pull her hair and make her cry, saying, Your mom's stuck up, so you must be stuck up too. Perhaps remembering that incident, Michelle shot Walter a harsh look. What, you got a problem with Walter or something? Tanner bristled. The atmosphere grew even more hostile. I stopped Michelle. I knew that no matter what we said to Tanner and his family, it wouldn't get through to them. I didn't want to ruin Andrew's funeral by arguing any further. Michelle seemed to pick up on that from my expression and swallowed her words. Both Michelle and I had plenty we wanted to say. But for now, the important thing was to get through the funeral without incident. I wanted to send Andrew off in peace. As hoped, the funeral ended smoothly, and all the mourners went home. Except for Tanner and Maria. Maria's parents had taken Walter and left early, so what on earth were they still doing here? Now that we've got a moment, let's talk about the inheritance, he said. So that's what this was about. Anticipating as much, Michelle and the others had stayed behind as well. Mary had been taken home by Michelle's husband Kendrick's parents. They knew all about Tanner and his family and had agreed to do so. This time, there is no inheritance for you, I stated firmly. Don't screw with me. That can't be right, Tanner protested. No, it's true. Think hard, I insisted. When Tanner purchased his new home, Andrew had provided a considerable sum as a gift before his death.
That's why there's nothing left from Andrew's estate to give to you. You're lying!
Tanner exclaimed desperately, but it was a fact, so there was nothing he could do. Money received from parents for a home purchase is tax-exempt. It should have been properly declared on the tax return. Remember now? I asked. Tanner's face turned pale as he listened to my explanation. He had conveniently sealed away that memory. He must have been really counting on Andrew's inheritance. Mom, I'm renouncing my inheritance. Please use the money Dad left for your life from now on, Michelle said, ever the kind daughter. In contrast, Tanner's claims were truly pathetic. No, I've set aside a proper amount for Michelle to receive. Mary will need education funds in the future, and Andrew would scold me if I didn't make sure Michelle accepted it. I explained. But Mom, you're still young, and they say life lasts 100 years now. I don't think having more money can hurt, so I want you to do that. Michelle insisted.
Then why don't you give us the portion she's supposed to receive? You're both saying you don't want the money, so wouldn't that tie things up nicely?
Maria suggested shamelessly. Michelle and I were so shocked we were at a loss for words. I couldn't believe she could say something like that without any embarrassment. Even more surprisingly, Tanner chimed in.
Yeah, let's do that. Come on, it's fine, right, Mom? Get out! How many times do I have to tell you, there's nothing for you? Leave before you make me any angrier!
I shouted. Perhaps startled by my intensity, Tanner and Maria finally showed signs of retreating, but not before Tanner left me with these parting words.
Well, I'll give up on Dad's inheritance. Well, only Dad's, that is. What's that supposed to mean?
I demanded.
Shut up. It's got nothing to do with you.
See you later, he said dismissively. I was sure he was now after the inheritance I would leave behind. I needed to take action while I was still healthy and able. As I was contemplating my next move, an unexpected opportunity arose. Apparently, there were plans to redevelop the area where I currently lived. Ultimately, they wanted to build a large apartment complex, so a salesman from a major construction company came to talk to me about selling the house. The current house was a pre-owned home I had bought when I returned from overseas to live with my in-laws. It held memories of Andrew, but also many unpleasant ones. In this house, influenced by my in-laws' words, Tanner had become the person he was today. Of course, it wasn't entirely my in-laws' fault. I couldn't do anything about it either, so in a sense, I was just as guilty. Remembering that filled me with a complex, indescribable feeling. Why don't you sell it and move to a place where you can live more comfortably, Mom? Michelle suggested, giving me the push I needed. I decided to sell the house and simultaneously began to put a certain plan into motion.
I heard the news. Isn't that great? I hear you've already bought a new house. We want to live with you too. From what I've heard, it's a single-family home with a vegetable garden and a yard.
Somehow, Tanner and his family had caught wind of it and came to me with those words.
I thought I told you before, there's nothing for Tanner.
I reminded them.
That was Dad's inheritance, right? The money from selling the house is your asset, Mom. In other words, it's your future inheritance. I should have a right to that, shouldn't I?
Tanner said with a nasty grin.
Mom's inheritance? Tanner, are you that eager for her to be gone?
Michelle asked, outraged. Hey, don't get the wrong idea.
I said future, didn't I? I don't remember saying today or tomorrow.
Tanner backpedaled. That's right, Michelle. Is your hearing going bad? We came to have this talk for Michaela's sake, so she can live a long and healthy life. Maria chimed in, a beautiful yet somehow vulgar smile on her face.
For her sake, so she can live a long and healthy life? What exactly are you talking about?
Michelle demanded.
It's simple. Maria and I will live with her,
Tanner declared.
What did you say?
Michelle asked, her eyes wide with exaggerated surprise as she looked at Tanner and Maria. Michaela is only going to get older from here on out. It would be more reassuring for her to live with us, don't you think? Maria reasoned. Normally, an offer from one's children to live together would be appreciated. But coming from this couple, there was nothing to be happy about.
I'm sorry, but I'll have to decline,
I said firmly.
Why?
Tanner asked, incredulous.
I heard you're about to be kicked out of the house you're living in now. It's the house you built with the gift from Andrew and help from Maria's father, right? How did it come to this?
I asked pointedly. I must have hit the nail on the head. Tanner clicked his tongue and turned his face away, looking displeased.
Shut up. What does it matter?
He grumbled.
That's right. We're going to be living with Michaela from now on, so we don't need to think about our current house anymore,
Maria added. The couple was clearly trying to avoid discussing their current living situation.
Anyway, it's decided that parents live with their oldest son,
Tanner declared.
We're moving here too,
Maria chimed in.
If you refuse, we won't take care of you for the rest of your life,
Tanner threatened. Completely ignoring my opinion, Tanner and his family left with those parting words. The plan worked out perfectly, didn't it? Michelle said with a laugh, but there was a hint of sadness in her voice.
Yes, I'm looking forward to moving day,
I replied. This was the certain strategy one had been working on while selling the house. Tanner and his family had fallen for it nicely. Even after that, Tanner and his family contacted me numerous times, but I never gave them a clear answer and continued to evade the topic of living together.
I've told you, I have no intention of living with you,
I repeated. Are you sure you can say that?
We'll seriously abandon you, Mom,
Tanner warned.
If that's how it is, then so be it. In any case, we won't be living together.
I stood my ground. No matter how many times I said it, he and his family persistently hounded me. I suppose it couldn't be helped. After all, he and his family had no money. I heard that their current house was mortgaged due to debt, and they couldn't even continue paying the interest. My estrangement from him and his family, and their subsequent downfall, began the year Michelle took her university entrance exams.
You're kidding, right? Michelle got into the same university as me? I can't believe it,
Tanner scoffed. It seemed he couldn't stand the fact that his sister Michelle, whom he had always looked down upon, had been accepted into the same university as him. When she called to report the good news, he hung up as soon as he heard it. Forget a celebration, he didn't even offer a word of congratulations. Furthermore, when his grandson Walter was born, he never reciprocated the gift Michelle had sent separately from us. When I admonished him for those things, this was his response.
I bet you're thrilled that Michelle got into the same university as me. But she's just a woman, after all. She'll never catch up to me. You'd better remember that, because she'll learn it the hard way someday.
Since then, we'd been estranged from him. Andrew and I had resigned ourselves to the situation, thinking it couldn't be helped. But then one day, out of the blue, Tanner called with this request.
I want you to cover the cost of our housekeeper. Maria's dad stopped paying for it, so our house is a mess. You've never done anything for us, so you can at least do that much, right?
According to Tanner, this is what happened. Maria's father's manager had fallen from power. Nothing happened to her father himself. He simply lost in the internal power struggle at the company. An opposing director became the new president, and Maria's father was relegated to a sinecure position. As a result, they no longer had the leeway to support Tanner and the others. Maria had no housekeeping skills to begin with, and the luxurious house they had built with Andrew's gift and her father's aid had always been cleaned by a housekeeper. Although Tanner was a high earner, his income wasn't enough to sustain such an extravagant lifestyle. So, he came to me seeking assistance.
Tanner, didn't you see me cleaning the house all this time? Maria doesn't have a job, and she's not ill. If you don't have money, you and your wife should clean up yourselves.
I told him.
Maria was raised as a lady, unlike you. We can't make her do that. I didn't climb the corporate ladder just to do housework. Don't you get it? A parent should want to help their child in need.
Tanner argued. If they were both working hard and still struggling to make ends meet, I would offer help. But that wasn't what Tanner was saying. They were continuing a lifestyle beyond their means and expected me to support it. I had no intention of doing so.
No matter what you say, I'm not going to help you. If you don't have money, live within your means. Everything else comes after that,
I stated firmly. He cursed at me over the phone for a while, but I absolutely didn't give in. When Tanner realized I wouldn't budge, he ended the call with these words.
Fine, but in exchange, I'm never taking care of you in your old age. Don't come crying to me when the time comes.
From then on, we were completely estranged, but it seemed they couldn't give up their lavish lifestyle and their debt only grew. Then Andrew passed away, and they came hoping to get their hands on the inheritance but were turned down. When they heard I was selling the house, I knew they would come crawling. Moving day arrived.
What, is that all of your luggage?
Tanner said, looking appalled. My belongings only filled one small truck. In contrast, Tanner and the others' luggage was lined up in several trucks, looking like a tour truck for some artist. In the end, he had forcefully pushed through the idea of living together.
I already gave up my house for her sake, so don't tell me you won't live with us now.
Tanner insisted. That's right. Tanner made this decision for Michaela's benefit, so you should show your sincerity too, Maria added. The couple had pressured me, half-threateningly, until I agreed. You don't need to worry about me.
I've decided to keep only what I need and let go of everything else,
I explained.
That works out then. It means there's more room for our stuff,
he said cheerfully as he got into his car.
Michaela, hurry up. We'll leave you behind,
Maria called out. I resigned myself and got into Michelle's car. It was time to depart. The two cars eventually arrived at the new house.
It's older than I thought,
Michelle remarked. It was an old house, over 50 years old.
Well, the inside is properly renovated, right?
I asked. Yes, the inside has been cleaned up nicely, Michelle replied.
I see. Let's quickly move the luggage inside,
Tanner said, directing the movers who had brought their belongings. Of course, he didn't even consider the truck carrying my luggage. He didn't even check if it had arrived. After seeing Tanner and the others start unloading, Kendrick quietly started the car. Amidst the voices of the movers and the sounds of shifting objects, they didn't seem to notice. We quietly left the place, heading straight for our real new home. A little while after leaving Tanner and the others, my cell phone started vibrating intensely. It was on silent mode, so it made no sound.
Looks like they've noticed,
Michelle said. With so many incoming calls, the battery would run out at this rate. I turned off my cell phone. I'll deal with it after reaching our destination. After driving for a while, we arrived at our true destination.
All right, please take care of it,
I said. The luggage was being carried one by one into the neatly arranged house. Actually, we had moved some things in advance a few times. To leave without Tanner and the others noticing, having too many vehicles would be troublesome. In the worst-case scenario, I considered abandoning the truck and fleeing quickly with Michelle and the others, so I only loaded things I could give up if necessary.
I'm glad I thought to bring the TV and fridge, assuming we could replace them. It's better to avoid buying new ones if possible, even though money can solve it,
I said. Michelle laughed cheerfully at my words. After settling the luggage, I turned on my cell phone. A call came through immediately.
Mom, where are you now? What the hell is this? There's no renovation at all,
Tanner yelled. Oh, it was cleaned nicely, wasn't it?
Michelle helped me, but it was a lot of work. From now on, you'll have to clean it properly yourselves,
I calmly replied. The place I guided Tanner and the others to was actually a fake new house. I came up with this plan to prevent them from following us to our real new home.
You don't have a place to live, right? So I'm giving you that house. It's a gift from my assets while I'm still alive,
I said.
Huh? Don't screw with me,
Tanner shouted. I'm not screwing with you.
That's the last thing I can give you, so take good care of it. Oh, and make sure to file your tax returns properly, or you'll be in trouble,
I stated firmly. The house is much cheaper than the amount Andrew gave Tanner for purchasing a new home. After all, it was built right after the Pacific War and is barely livable.
You lost your job and have no income now, right? That land is designated as farmland, so you could grow vegetables with Maria. You shouldn't have trouble feeding yourselves,
I suggested.
There's no way we can do that,
Tanner protested.
Why not? Everything we eat is grown by someone. There's no reason you can't do it too.
Tanner insisted he was an elite and looked down on those who worked up a sweat or got dirty doing farm work. A little hardship and developing a sense of gratitude would do him good.
Oh, and I figured you might have trouble getting by until the harvest, so I stocked the kitchen with rice, seasonings, canned and instant foods, things like ramen. Consider it my last act as your mom.
Be grateful for it. I could hear Tanner saying something, but I silently hung up the phone. I'd need to keep in touch for a while longer. Once everything was settled, I'd cancel this cell phone. For the sake of my new life. No matter how much they complained, the Thompson family had no choice but to live in that new house. They'd lost their old home, unable to pay back their debt. And Tanner had lost his job too. His arrogance and condescension towards others had earned him repeated warnings during internal audits. But he never reflected on his behavior or tried to improve his attitude. In the end, he was demoted and he quit, declaring he'd go to a company that recognized his true value. Tanner was so convinced he was special, he seemed to think companies would be lining up to hire him. Reality wasn't so kind. No company would willingly take on someone who caused those kinds of problems. Desperate, he'd apparently gone to great lengths to try to sell that house, but it was a property he'd gotten for next to nothing due to lack of buyers in the first place. No matter what he did, he couldn't find a buyer. Giving up and continuing to live there was his only remaining choice. Now, it seems he's receiving the bare minimum of assistance from Maria's father and has started growing vegetables in the fields. If they work hard, they shouldn't have trouble feeding themselves. I heard Maria, who had never worked a day in her life, is even helping with the farm work, sweating under the sun. Of course, they have to do their own housekeeping too. Apparently, she has even taken a part-time job to make ends meet. Walter, who was the spitting image of Tanner, seems to have learned from seeing his parents' transformation. I heard he transferred schools and now gets along quietly with his friends without acting arrogant. That's the one thing that puts my mind at ease. I know it was a pretty harsh judgment, and I sometimes wonder if it was really the right thing to do. But I don't want Walter to end up like Tanner. He doesn't need to become an elite. It's enough if he grows up to be a kind, ordinary person. I believe that wish will come true. I actually moved to a quiet suburb in the neighboring state. I'm living there with Michelle and her family now. She encouraged me to sell the house and offered to let me live with them.
We both have jobs we can do from home, so we can move anywhere. Why don't you come live with us, out of Tanner's reach?
My granddaughter Mary has allergies, and they were thinking of moving somewhere with clean air. Michelle convinced me it was perfect timing, and I gratefully accepted. Since moving here, Mary has gotten much healthier, and I'm spending my days in peace. Like I told Tanner back then, I decided to keep only what I needed and let go of everything else. The biggest thing I cut out was Tanner and his family. If I had kept ties with them out of a sense of parent-child obligation or blood relation, I never would have found this tranquility. It's unfortunate things turned out this way, but I feel unburdened now and I'm looking forward. I can spend the rest of my life here with my daughter and her family in peace.
This person hasn't regained consciousness even once since being brought to the hospital.
Yes, that's right. It seems her body became weaker after a fracture before.
Then it's about time, isn't it? I'll prepare the funeral wreath.
As I was speechless at my assail Nancy's words, Nancy, without showing any concern for me, looked down at Mom lying in the bed and said,
"So, I can finally say goodbye,"
and laughed mockingly before walking away. I was dumbfounded, unable to understand and too stunned to even feel angry. I sat down, placed my hand on my forehead, and sighed. This was too harsh to be a joke. Not funny at all. Is it even right to say such things about one's own parent? I don't have children, so I don't know, but I think I would be sad if my daughter spoke to me that way. As I thought this, my MIL Barbara, who had been unconscious, slowly began to rise.
"Oh my! Barbara!"
I woke up because I heard Nancy's voice. That's right, there was something I wanted to tell before I die. Barbara spoke to me with a clarity unexpected from someone who had been unconscious. And I will never forget the smile on her face. Just 3 days later, Barbara passed away in the hospital where she was admitted. It was around the time when the buds on the cherry tree visible from the hospital room window were just beginning to bloom. My name is Linda. I am 58 years old this year, and my husband David, who is the same age, and I have lived a peaceful life without any major fights or troubles since our marriage. The only regret in our lives was not having children, but after we both turned 50, we stopped worrying about it from the bottom of our hearts and started looking forward to how we would spend our retirement together. David had been running a chain of eateries for a long time, but was transferred to the headquarters for his skills, and now he is in charge of several stores, leading a busy life. As a housewife, I tried my best to support my busy husband by always being frugal and ensuring he could truly rest when he came home by keeping the room clean and always arranging flowers by the living room window every weekend. I don't know if David is interested in flowers, but arranging seasonal flowers in a vase became my only hobby, hoping it would bring him some comfort. That's an unusual flower, isn't it? Lily of the valley? David pointed at the flower on the table and said to me. Without touching his breakfast bread and with a cup of black coffee in one hand and the newspaper in the other, he shifted his gaze to the flower. It's a snowdrop. In a small vase made for single flowers, a delicate white flower blooms downward at the tip of its slender stem, presenting a cool demeanor. The white flower, mistaken by David for a lily of the valley, is a cute flower that tells us of the arrival of spring in our garden. They bloomed in the garden's flower bed again this year. I decorated with a few because they're so cute. They might wither quickly since they don't take up water well.
I see. They're beautiful.
David folded the newspaper on the table and quietly murmured as he looked at the flower again. How has Barbara been lately?
What do you mean?
Are you in touch? Aren't you going to visit during the holidays this year? Even though we didn't have children, we still visited each other's parents a few times a year. However, recently, David has been busy with the opening preparations of new eateries he's in charge of, making it difficult to take a long break. David folded the newspaper, looked up at the clock on the wall, and stood up. That was my cue to hand him his lunch. Take care. Will you be home early today?
Not sure. Oh, no. I'll be home early today,
David said while looking at the calendar on the wall. Today was their wedding anniversary. After David left the house, I started preparing to make the special meal I had planned for today. The sunlight streaming through the curtains grew stronger, signaling it was noon. I was heating up last night's dinner in the microwave when the phone rang. The landline, which rarely rings. It was mostly unused, but calls from relatives or Barbara usually came through it. So, when the landline rang, it often meant something had happened with the family, and I picked up the receiver a bit nervously. Hello? It was Barbara on the line.
It's been a while, hasn't it?
Barbara greeted me in her usual tone. Sorry for calling out of the blue. David's not there, I assume, since it's a weekday. There's something I wanted to ask him. I see. I'll pass the message when he gets back. That would be great, thank you. Actually, Barbara explained that she had fractured her right leg recently when she missed a step on her staircase at home. She had called an ambulance herself and received treatment, but now she was finding it difficult to do shopping due to her condition.
Having a fractured leg is really troublesome. I've been able to take care of myself until now, but even small tasks have become difficult at this age.
I see. If it's okay with you, I can help out. I'm a housewife and have some free time.
What are you talking about? I know because I was a housewife too. It's tough being a housewife. Husbands expect more than just ordinary housework as if it's a given. Isn't David being demanding?
I chuckled over the phone. David is very kind and wouldn't get upset over me cutting corners with the housework. I thought Barbara, being his mom, must understand this even better than I do, maybe even more than I realize. That night, David came home unusually early. We enjoyed a delicious dinner together, sipped on slightly expensive beer, and reminisced about funny stories from when we first met. The cake David brought home was a cheesecake from my favorite shop. The shop was in the opposite direction of his workplace, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought that he went out of his way to choose my favorite shop instead of one nearby. After dinner, while doing the dishes, I told David about the call from Barbara. David came to my side while I was washing the dishes. What did you say? I wiped the washed dishes with a towel and put them back on the shelf. Barbara fractured her leg at home. She asked if you could take her to the hospital and for shopping, maybe once every 2 weeks, by car.
Once every 2 weeks? She's really holding back. Actually, someone needs to take care of Mom. Life would be uncertain otherwise.
I know it might be presumptuous, but when I offered to help, she refused. She told me to take good care of you instead. David laughed heartily and then immediately turned serious. With Fael gone, there had always been concerns about Barbara's living situation. David, somewhat reluctantly, took out his mobile phone and, while scratching his head, "Guess I should give her a call," muttered. "Ah, it's me, David." "Sis?" Ah, right. David walked out of the living room with his mobile phone to his ear. The call was to Nancy. Nancy is a year older than David and works in PR for a company in the city center. Honestly, I don't know much about Nancy, who hardly ever shows up at family gatherings, but I was vaguely aware that Barbara spoke ill of her, so I knew their relationship wasn't good. David returned with a grim expression and sat down. She said she doesn't care about Mom. That's terrible. Well, it's not like we can do much either. Can't be helped. I know someone who arranges home helpers. I'll talk to them sometime. David acted swiftly, and by the following week, a home helper started visiting Barbara's house. Initially, Barbara complained, but she eventually accepted the fact that she couldn't manage everything on her own and expressed her gratitude for David's kindness. Years passed by in the blink of an eye. As usual, I opened the curtains to let in the morning sunlight. The snowdrops that used to bloom in our garden around this time every year were absent. While the green stems of these bulbous plants were growing, they hadn't blossomed into their characteristic white flowers. It happens, I thought, slightly disappointed, as I yawned. The landline rang. Caught off guard by the phone ringing mid-yawn, I ended up coughing. As I picked up the receiver, my heart rate sped up when the caller identified themselves as the reception at the university hospital.
I'll be right there.
Without asking for details, I quickly got ready and jumped into the car. I had heard that Barbara's health had been deteriorating. Frantically, I grabbed my mobile phone to inform David that I was heading to Barbara's hospital. Noticing my fingers trembling on the steering wheel, I tried to calm my nerves by taking deep breaths at a red light. It's going to be okay. It has to be. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about the snowdrops I had seen in the flower bed earlier. Despite their lush green stems, the absence of even a single bud made them look more like weeds, unsettling me in my current state. Upon arriving at the hospital, I found David waiting. He was in his suit, apparently having been inspecting a nearby store when I called, and had rushed over. We were just told it might be tough considering her age. David looked exhausted as he shared this with me. Leaving David outside, I lightly knocked and entered Barbara's hospital room. There, Barbara lay unconscious. Her thin arm, now much leaner, peeked out from under a white blanket, and I instinctively looked away. Despite our shock, we discussed with the doctor what steps to take next, concluding that as her family, we should care for her daily. David's job didn't allow him much time, so the majority of the caregiving fell to me, but I accepted this responsibility and continued to care for Barbara diligently. I would gently change her position and wipe her back, even though she remained unconscious. Every hour, I massaged her back and diligently rubbed her swollen legs, trying to improve her circulation. One day, I had to leave the hospital to pick up some necessities for Barbara's stay from a nearby drugstore. When I returned to the room with shopping bags in hand, I found Nancy there unexpectedly. "Nancy, you came to see Barbara." I was genuinely happy that Nancy had come to visit Barbara. Despite everything, the fact that Nancy came to see her, even if it was a bit late, made me happy, thinking she must have been worried after hearing that Barbara had lost consciousness. Nancy glanced at me and then smirked unpleasantly, curling one side of her mouth. "This person hasn't regained consciousness even once since being brought to the hospital, it seems." "Yes, that's right. It seems her body has weakened since the fracture before."
"Then it's about time, isn't it? I'll prepare the funeral wreath."
I was speechless at Nancy's words. Without showing any concern for me, Nancy looked down at Mom lying in the bed and said,
"So, I can finally say goodbye,"
and laughed mockingly before walking away. I was dumbfounded, unable to comprehend and too stunned to even feel angry. I sat down, placed my hand on my forehead, and sighed. This was too harsh to be a joke. Not funny at all. Is it even right to say such things about one's own parent? I don't have children, so I don't know, but I think I would be sad if my daughter spoke to me that way. As I was thinking, Barbara, who had been unconscious, slowly began to rise.
Oh my! Barbara!
I woke up because I heard Nancy's voice. That's right, there was something I wanted to tell before I die. Barbara spoke to me with a clarity unexpected from someone who had been unconscious. And I will never forget the smile on her face. Just 3 days later, Barbara passed away in the hospital where she was admitted. It was around the time when the buds on the cherry tree visible from the hospital room window were just beginning to bloom.
The cherry blossoms will be here soon,
I said to Barbara, and she smiled weakly. Take me outside, in a wheelchair or anything, she had said. I never thought she would pass away so soon. After Barbara passed away, David immediately notified the relatives as per the doctor's information. While the attending physician was filling out the death certificate for Barbara's body to be transported home, Nancy appeared out of nowhere. My expression darkened instantly, and I nudged David's shoulder.
See? Just like I predicted, right? I told you it was about time. Nancy. Enough is enough. Oh dear. Because you were looking after Mom for the inheritance, you find it troublesome that someone like me shows up, don't you?
I felt a rush of blood to my head, but David immediately shouted.
Get out!
He yelled. Nancy, seemingly taken aback by this, widened her eyes in surprise, but then smirked again and said,
Let's talk after the funeral is over. About what's to come.
She then left. I clenched my fists, feeling a tightness in my chest from frustration. The funeral proceeded without any hitches, but it was a challenging time for David and me. We were utterly exhausted. Most of the funeral arrangements were made by us. We contacted the funeral home, discussed the schedule and details, and held the service. Barbara had told David she preferred a small funeral, so we only invited close relatives. Nancy called us to the smoking area of the funeral home and handed us canned coffee. She took out a cigarette from her bag, lit it, and inhaled deeply with relish.
We should sell the family home and split Mom's savings and other assets in half, right?
Nancy asked, pointing the lit end of her cigarette towards David's face. Since neither David nor I smoked, we stood a bit away from the smoking area, resulting in our voices being raised to converse with Nancy.
We're not thinking about selling the house right now. Don't you think it's disrespectful to even discuss this so soon after the funeral? I wonder how it works in such cases. Should we assess the family home's value and then David pays me half of that?
Suppressing the urge to throw the can of coffee in Nancy's face, I stepped forward, ahead of David. Nancy looked at me somewhat surprised, stubbed out her cigarette in the ashtray, and lit another one.
Actually, Barbara mentioned there was a will. A will? I haven't heard about it. On that day you showed such disrespect to Barbara, who was unconscious. Barbara told me she had prepared a will while she was still in good health. And she told me what's in it.
Barbara, on that day, had left a note written hastily on stationery about the general contents of her will and a memo stating that no one was allowed to contest it. She had already entrusted the actual will to a notary, so she couldn't show it, but she weakly smiled, saying she remembered the contents well that she had noted down. When Barbara handed me the envelope containing the hastily written note, her expression was serene, as if she had resolved any lingering regrets. Nancy, with a cigarette between her lips, read the contents labeled will. Her expression gradually hardened, and when her gaze shifted from the will to me, she stubbed out her cigarette and approached. As Nancy got closer, The smell of cigarette prompted me to grimace involuntarily.
What do you mean by this? You're saying all of Mom's inheritance goes to you guys? Don't joke with me.
I glared at Nancy with a firm stance. When Barbara handed me this will, she had held my hand, thanked me, and with a face of sorrow I had never seen before, she pleaded. Please. I couldn't erase Barbara's beseeching face from my mind.
There's one will, but there's another document Barbara left behind. She asked me to make sure it's enforced, even if it means going to court. Don't beat around the bush. Just hand it over. What is this document? It's a promissory note.
At that, Nancy slightly raised her eyebrows and placed her hand on her chin.
What does that mean?
She seemed to be pondering, but it was clear Nancy didn't understand the significance of the term promissory note in this context. That was understandable. To be honest, I was also surprised when I first saw this promissory note. Whether Barbara was meticulous by nature or just precise about financial matters, she had recorded in great detail the money she had lent to her daughter, Nancy. The record of debts, listed with dates, times, amounts lent, and reasons, filled about half of the notebook. Most entries hinted at Nancy's financial contributions to boyfriends she had dated when she was younger. After I briefly explained the contents of the promissory note, Nancy confronted me, her face pale.
She recorded everything in such detail. Always criticizing the people I dated, always something. Linda, how much does it all come to? There's at least $80,000. However, there's no mention of the interest rate, so the statutory rate would apply.
The actual amount on the promissory note was about $25,000, but I lied effortlessly. The repayment deadline had long passed, and Nancy, having some legal knowledge, would understand that this story didn't add up. Yet, I pressed on. I couldn't let Nancy take away the savings Barbara had accumulated or the family home she cherished.
The original is with a lawyer, but Barbara had one suggestion before we proceed with a claim against Nancy.
Nancy was clearly flustered by this unexpected turn of events. While contemplating whether to light another cigarette and idly twirling it between her fingers, I conveyed to Nancy what Barbara had told me. If she didn't contest the inheritance, we would let the matter of the debt slide.
Most of Barbara's savings were used for the funeral, and selling the family home will take time. If you contest the inheritance, the debt repayment will commence immediately, which would surely complicate your life.
I tried to speak as gently as possible, not wanting to provoke Nancy. David, standing beside me, looked tense, glancing back and forth between Nancy and me. Soon, a staff member from the crematorium came too. We're ready. Inform us. Watching Barbara's body being placed in the cremation chamber was a moment of profound sorrow, even for me. It must have been even more difficult for David. Yet, strangely, seeing her reduced to ashes brought a sense of peace. As we waited for the bus to take us home from the crematorium, David looked relieved, taking deep breaths of the fresh outdoor air. I stood silently by his side until Nancy approached us awkwardly and said,
I'll go by the will. But please spare me the loan part. What about selling the family home? You can handle it however you like. But I can't pay back the loan.
After saying that, she didn't wait for our response and returned to the smoking area. David remained silent. Watching Nancy's retreating figure, he seemed to want to say something witty but eventually just looked down, resigned. Later, it was revealed that Nancy had quit her job, hoping to inherit from Barbara. She had moved to a downtown apartment and indulged in nightclub visits and luxury shopping, leading to financial distress. It was baffling how she could make such decisions. Believing there was a significant inheritance, Barbara had indeed lent Nancy a considerable amount of money, perhaps fostering Nancy's belief in available funds. Forced to move to a standard apartment and start a part-time job, Nancy's arrogant attitude led to her quick dismissal, and she eventually had to leave that apartment too. At the family court, when Barbara's will was unsealed in the presence of witnesses, it confirmed that all her assets were left to David and me, as Barbara had stated. Though it was expected, Nancy remained silent, sighing deeply and looking defeated. Nancy is now scraping by with a live-in part-time job, but we have no sympathy for her. David, her brother, shares my reluctance to interact further, and one day, the landline was removed from our home. We've decided to keep in touch only with close relatives. Yet, there's a part of me that wonders if this lonely conclusion was truly for the best. I wonder if this was truly the right ending for Barbara. Time passed, and as the first anniversary of Barbara's passing approached, having received the inheritance, we built a respectable grave and continued to live our lives as usual, mindful not to waste money unnecessarily. On a warm day heralding the arrival of spring, I noticed the white snowdrops that hadn't bloomed last year now adorning the flower bed visible through the open window. These flowers hung towards the ground, swaying like earrings. I couldn't help but step outside and bend down to admire the flowers in the flower bed. Among them were low-lying pansies and violas, adding a vibrant splash of color. I gently touched the snowdrops with my fingertips. David returned from a neighborhood stroll on his bicycle, his basket filled with various vegetables.
What's with all these vegetables?
Got them from the local farmer's market. They were cheap, so I bought a bunch.
Even if they were cheap, this is a lot.
Seeing the basket brimming with vegetables, I exclaimed,
"Ah!"
And with a slightly mischievous expression, I suggested to David,
"Let's use these vegetables to make a variety of dishes that celebrate spring." "All of them? You think we can eat that much?"
"Why not invite Nancy over?" David widened his eyes, his smile tinged with disbelief, as if he'd misheard me. Nancy would likely have plenty of complaints about my vegetable dishes. But even if she's not fond of them, making fried vegetables might soften their bitterness, making them palatable. Still, Nancy might refuse to eat or even decline the invitation to our home altogether. Yet, if she did come over, I'd insist on showing her the snowdrops blooming in the garden. I'd bring her to the flower bed, have her sit where I am, and even suggest visiting Barbara's grave together, though she'd surely refuse. But if she found the flowers beautiful, I believe we might come to understand each other, even if just a little.
Today, we're having a Christmas party with 20 family members. Make sure you don't embarrass me.
I was filled with questions at Kieran's statement. The Christmas party was supposed to be at Kieran's brother, Tommy's house. Soon after, my father-in-law Brent and mother-in-law Annie arrived. Seeing me clutching my stomach and breathing heavily, they looked furious, like they were about to face a demon. Then, Annie shouted Kieran, and stormed back into the living room. There, Brent grabbed Kieran by the collar, and the next moment, a loud noise filled the room. My name is Emma. I'm a 31-year-old housewife. I married Kieran when I was 28. We met at a cafe we both frequented. We were regulars who knew each other by face and greeted when we met. It was just that until one day, when the cafe's popular dish was down to the last one, Kieran let me have it. Kieran is a big guy with a loud voice to match. He's assertive, but he was shyly offering me the dish that day. His bashfulness contrasted with his size, which I found adorable. Looking back, I was too naive. We exchanged numbers and went on a few dates. Our first date was for steak, and on the next one, he took me, in my casual outfit, to a fancy restaurant, a bit out of place. Kieran can be inconsiderate, making decisions without consulting others. He works at a major electronics company, where he's known for being the fastest to get promoted among his peers. He's proud of his work, which often leads to him acting on his own. Love is blind, they say, and I mistook Kieran's assertiveness for masculinity, which I now deeply regret. On our third date, Kieran proposed to me. It felt too soon, but he had already booked a wedding venue. Before I could even respond, I was shocked by his initiative. Eventually, his persistence led to a whirlwind marriage just a few months after we met. My parents were surprised too, but, like me, were overwhelmed by Kieran's forcefulness. He wanted me to quit my job right after getting married, but it was all too sudden, and I couldn't leave my job. I told Kieran I'd work until I got pregnant, and he reluctantly agreed. He was the type who preferred his wife to be a housewife. The first year of our marriage passed without incident, and it was a happy one. However, Kieran still made decisions unilaterally, from buying a car to choosing our new home without consulting me. I had dreamed of seeing the aurora borealis on our honeymoon, but next thing I knew, we were eating pasta in Italy. If I ignored Kieran's selfishness, it was a happy life. But everything changed when I found out I was pregnant after a year. It felt less like tumbling down a hill and more like being on a roller coaster. As promised, I quit my job to focus on homemaking. To our surprise, I was pregnant with twins. Kieran, deeply moved, looked forward to being a dad to 2 kids at once. He was so proud that he even bragged about it at work. His phone wallpaper was the ultrasound image of the fetuses, which he showed off everywhere. I secretly found it in poor taste, but I kept quiet. The thought of twins made me more anxious than happy. Kieran, on the other hand, was over the moon and seemed indifferent to my worries. The obstetrician advised a hospital stay due to the risks of a multiple birth, which Kieran agreed to. He must have been worried about what could happen. Hospitalization was a relief for me, but it brought new worries about household matters. Kieran didn't do housework. Being the eldest of 3 brothers, he had never had to. It wasn't just that he didn't, he couldn't. The fact that his family lineage was well respected and he was a direct descendant had spoiled him. He had always had someone to take care of even his personal needs. It seemed someone had been helping out not just with the household chores, but even with personal care. I couldn't possibly leave Kieran alone at home in that state. The thought of tidying up the house after being discharged was something I felt I couldn't possibly manage. So, I asked Brent and Annie for help. I requested them to either have Kieran stay at their house while I was hospitalized or to have Annie take care of our home. I get along well with both Brent and Annie. The typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflict doesn't apply to us. Despite coming from a distinguished family, they're very down-to-earth and easy to talk to. The typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflict doesn't apply to us. Kieran ended up staying at his parents' house until I was discharged from the hospital after giving birth. I checked into the hospital, feeling relieved. Under the care of the doctors and nurses, I safely delivered twins through a cesarean section. A healthy boy and girl, both crying loudly. When it was time to leave the hospital, Kieran, Brent, Annie, Kieran's siblings and their families, and my parents all came. We were a large family of 10. The nurses and doctors were surprised to see such a large group. They commented on how happy our family seemed. To an outsider, we must have looked like a happy clan. Although I felt a bit embarrassed by the commotion, I was secretly pleased. That moment was the peak of my happiness. But life became challenging from there. Kieran's attitude changed drastically. My life before and after giving birth were polar opposites. And not for the better. Issues I had noticed before became more pronounced, and any endearing qualities he might have had disappeared. This change started when Kieran returned home. The first thing he said was, "There's nothing like being in your own home." As he stretched out comfortably. I stretched myself too thin, indeed. I, too, thought my home was the best. But here I am, with twins in a baby carrier and bags in both hands. Thinking about the life ahead, there's just no way I can afford to stretch myself thin and relax. Brent, Annie, and my parents had all kindly suggested that we spend some time alone as a family. My parents live about 2 hours away by train, so they decided to stay in a hotel for the night. I suggested they stay with us to save the trouble, but they insisted on going to the hotel directly from the hospital.
It was nice being at my parents' home, but Mom could be really nagging after a while.
Kieran threw the baby care items we got from the maternity ward onto the floor and slumped down on the sofa. Then, astonishingly, he demanded, "I want a hot coffee." With both my hands full, and even one baby against my chest and another on my back, Kieran had the audacity to ask for coffee. And not just any coffee, but hot coffee at that. How does he expect me to set up the coffee maker and pour it into a cup in this state? And he was even complaining about his shoulders being sore, rotating them as if he was the one in need of care. I decided to ignore his request for the moment, and gently laid the twins down in their crib next to the living room. That's when I felt a dull pain in my abdomen. The cesarean section wound hadn't fully healed yet. My body stiffened from the pain, and my expression contorted. But Kieran didn't even glance my way, absorbed with his mobile phone. Raising my voice at Kieran would only risk waking the twins. And I was still too weak from the hospital stay. After putting the twins to sleep, I chose to remain silent, prioritizing their sleep and my recovery. Kieran showed no interest in either household chores or childcare. It was a stark contrast to just a short while ago when even the nurses envied our happiness. Now, all I felt was anxiety. The next day, my parents arrived early. And by the afternoon, Brent and Annie had also come to help. The four of us, along with the two sets of grandparents, began the challenging task of caring for the twins. Kieran, as expected, was of no help at all. In fact, he required more attention than the babies themselves. While dealing with Kieran on the side, I devoted myself to learning the ropes of parenting. Annie reassured me, saying that this is the time when the children teach you to be a mom. It was hard to believe that someone as supportive as Annie was Kieran's mother. My parents live farther away than my in-laws, so my mom can't visit as easily. It looks like we'll be relying more on Brent and Annie. Brent is still working, so we'll mainly depend on Annie. I'm really grateful that Annie is such a kind person. Both Brent and Annie adore the twins. Even when I'm clumsily changing diapers, they tell me not to rush and are very supportive. Amidst this, Kieran was the one who became sullen. He felt left out as we were all focused on the twins. He became more demanding than usual, asking for water, wanting to read the newspaper, or saying he was hungry. Brent tried to engage Kieran in parenting, saying, "It can be hard for dads to get involved in childcare, but it's rewarding once you try." Annie is kind, but Brent is also a good person. I wonder how someone like Kieran could come from such great parents. My dad also shared how nervous he was when he first took me out, trying to relate to Kieran. But Kieran showed no interest in these valuable lessons. All that came out of Kieran's mouth were disinterested responses like, "Oh, really?" Brent and my dad's stories were meant to ease the embarrassment and anxiety of making mistakes, a kindness towards Kieran. However, Kieran seemed uninterested even in their stories. Then, Kieran went too far. Not only did he show no interest in childcare, but his selfish behavior finally made Brent and Annie angry. While I was breastfeeding the twins, Kieran came up to me, asking if the food ready yet because he's hungry. Moreover, he insisted on having a proper meal, not just any frozen food. As I was bewildered, wondering what he expected me to do while I was in the middle of breastfeeding, Brent stepped in to offer his help. "You're not a child. If you're hungry, make something yourself." Brent's statement was completely reasonable. Yet, Kieran became visibly angry. "You're a housewife, so it's only natural you should cook. I rarely use frozen food in the meals I prepare." But to Kieran, even one frozen item meant I was cutting corners. Annie joined the argument as well. "Babies can't make and eat their own food." Brent further suggested that since Kieran could also feed the baby with formula milk, he should take a turn at feeding. Faced with unanimous criticism, Kieran made a shocking statement. "If I do the feeding, then there's nothing left for the mother to do." This comment left Brent, Annie, and my parents dumbfounded. All I could do was sigh. Afterward, Annie relentlessly lectured him, and Brent thoroughly taught him childcare tasks like changing diapers. Kieran's face during this time was sullen, clearly showing his reluctance. 2 years passed, and I became pregnant again. Kieran hadn't changed at all during these years. I was constantly busy with the twins and household chores. Without Brent and Annie's help, our family life would have fallen apart long ago. Annie helped with the housework, and Brent tried to teach Kieran about parenting. Kieran, seemingly annoyed by his parents, found excuses to leave the house often. He claimed he was busy with work trips and overtime work, but it seemed he just didn't want to be home. This pregnancy wasn't twins, but my morning sickness was worse than before. I couldn't stand the smell of bread, so pasta became a regular meal. Kieran was unhappy about this too, constantly complaining about wanting bread. Annie, frustrated by his complaints, told him to make his own meals. Surrounded by Annie and Brent, Kieran reluctantly cooked. Regardless of how it looked, I tried to eat the meal he prepared. However, due to my morning sickness, I couldn't finish it. Kieran sighed dramatically at the sight of the leftover food.
I went through the trouble of making this, and this is what I get? If it's too awful to eat, just say so.
After dropping this sarcastic remark, Kieran left the house. He returned an hour later. From that point on, Kieran completely stopped doing any housework or childcare. His excuse was that his efforts were a waste of goodwill. Unashamedly, on his days off, he started fishing as a hobby. On weekdays, he used work and socializing at work events as excuses to go to bars, coming home late. There were days when I didn't even see Kieran's face. I apologized multiple times about the meal issue and asked for his help around the house. Hoping he'd come home earlier on weekdays and spend some weekends at home was a modest request, I thought. I just wanted him to spend a little time with the twins. But Kieran's response was unbelievable.
You've been raising the twins for 2 years. You must be used to it by now.
With that, he'd leave for fishing. And
this is your second pregnancy, and it's just one baby this time. There's nothing I can do.
He'd even say things like that. The twins, now 2 years old, haven't warmed up to Kieran at all, perhaps due to his indifferent attitude. In fact, they seem to dislike being around Kieran. They'd even start to cry if he just walked by. What I regret is wondering why I got pregnant with a third child. Perhaps I was fooled by Kieran's occasional whims of kindness. It's regrettable, but there's nothing I can do about it now. The baby growing inside me isn't to blame. Despite my frustrations, my pregnancy was progressing smoothly, and I was nearing full term. Like last time, I was scheduled for a cesarean section. The preparations for hospitalization weren't an issue, thanks to my previous experience. However, the due date being right after Christmas meant a busy holiday season. There would be a big Christmas party at the in-laws, which I'd likely miss this year. The biggest concern for this birth was Kieran. Now, there was the added responsibility of taking care of the twins. I needed Kieran's help. But I knew it was too much to ask for him to take time off work for the birth. So, to compromise, I asked if he could at least take care of the kids after work. His response was cold and devoid of kindness, saying he couldn't make such a promise. Then, Kieran said something even worse.
It's embarrassing for a man to take time off work for his wife's birth. It makes me look like a useless husband who's henpecked by his wife.
Unable to hold back any longer, I was about to retort when Kieran demanded food. His words immediately drained my will to argue. He continued to complain during the meal, upset by my request.
By the age of 2, they should be able to eat by themselves.
They might be able to eat, but they certainly can't cook. Kieran lacks the quality of thoughtfulness. Irritated, I couldn't help but respond.
Then you should be able to do more than a 2-year-old. Show them how it's done.
Unfazed by my sarcasm, Kieran said something even more outrageous.
I'm fine. You all live off my earnings.
How does that logic even work? Kieran's argument is far too flawed. Up until my hospitalization, he He repeatedly reminded me that he was the one providing for me. I never intended to quit my job. It was Kieran who insisted I leave work to focus on household duties after we got married. Each time he says I'm providing for the family, I think to myself, you have no right to say that. With all these frustrations, the week of my hospitalization arrived. Then, Kieran made another insensitive comment. Make sure you attend the Christmas party. I couldn't understand why he would say such a thing. He was worried it would look bad if the eldest son of the family with direct lineage to respected ancestry attended alone. He had no understanding of the pain and risks involved in giving birth. Childbirth is a life-threatening endeavor. Kieran continued with unbelievable remarks. Why should I be the only one to attend? Who's going to do the cooking and serve the drinks? Was he mistaking me for a servant or a housekeeper? It was unthinkable to risk my life for the sake of Kieran's pride. It's astonishing what Kieran can come up with. Kieran and I repeatedly had intense exchanges of come and no, it's impossible. In the end, Brent talked to Kieran, and it was decided that I wouldn't attend. As Christmas approached, Kieran remained sullen, and it was the day before my hospitalization. Unfortunately, it also happened to be the day of the Christmas party. On the day of the Christmas party, I was experiencing some abdominal discomfort and was lying down beside the twins. Suddenly, I realized Kieran was standing there. Groggily, I looked up at Kieran.
Today, we're having a Christmas party with 20 family members. Make sure you don't embarrass me.
I wonder what Kieran is saying. I was filled with confusion at Kieran's words. The party was supposed to be at Tommy's house. Kieran sat down and shook my shoulder. He was demanding a meal for 20 people and desserts that the ladies would enjoy. It seemed Kieran had unilaterally decided to host the Christmas party at our house. Brent, Annie, and the rest of the family had been considerate about the twins and my pregnancy. I couldn't understand why suddenly 20 people were expected today. I hadn't noticed, but there were missed calls from Annie and Brent on my mobile phone. I was scheduled for hospitalization tomorrow. Labor could start at any time now. It was absolutely impossible to entertain 20 relatives under these circumstances. I told Kieran it was unreasonable to spring this on me suddenly. At the expense of paying a little more, couldn't we arrange for a catering service? I even humbly suggested. However, Kieran angrily raised his voice, insisting the party be at our house. Are you trying to shame me? As the wife of the eldest son of a family with direct lineage to respected ancestry, you should maintain your dignity. Kieran was imposing his selfish demands, continuing with outdated views that a wife should silently obey her husband. I lost the energy to argue back. When I fell silent, Kieran seemed to take it as agreement, smiling smugly. He then announced he was going to pick up the relatives and told me to prepare for the party before leaving. Given how everything was arranged, I couldn't possibly refuse. It would inconvenience all the relatives. With that thought in mind, I began to get ready, despite my large belly. I texted Kieran to let him know that going shopping was out of the question and I'd have to make do with what we had. I had stocked up on groceries considering my upcoming hospital stay, so using them up wouldn't be an issue. Despite the discomfort from my tight belly, I managed to prepare the meals. We were short on drinks, so I decided to order them and get it delivered. Just as I finished all the preparations, Kieran texted to say he was on his way home. In just 2 hours, I had prepared the food and drinks. I wished I could pat myself on the back. The twins were getting sleepy, so I put them to bed in another room. Soon, I heard the front door open and lively voices. I went to greet everyone. Annie and Brent expressed their concern, asking me if I was okay. The call earlier was probably made out of concern for me. I could only respond with a vague smile and tried to brush it off. The living and dining areas were packed with 20 guests, and the Christmas party began. I was so busy serving food and drinks that I didn't have a moment to sit down. Everyone kept asking if I was okay, but I just laughed it off. Kieran, on the other hand, was in a good mood, boasting about my resilience. However, Brent, Annie, and Tommy looked worried. Standing continuously while preparing and moving around to pour drinks made the tightness in my abdomen increasingly unbearable. Eventually, I excused myself to check on the children, using it as a reason to leave the room. Watching the twins sleep, I too fell asleep. Sometime later, what felt like tightness turned into pain. Not wanting to worry anyone, I covered my mouth with my hands. The pain in my belly grew sharper and more intense. It had been 3 hours since Kieran sprung the Christmas party on me. As I endured the pain, suddenly the door opened. And there stood Tommy, seemingly having mistaken the room for the bathroom.
Sorry, I mistook this for the bathroom.
Saying this, Tommy closed the door and hurried away. Soon after, Brent and Annie arrived. Seeing me clutching my stomach and breathing heavily, they looked furious. The next moment, Annie shouted for Kieran and stormed back into the living room. I weakly stood up and returned to the living room as well. There, I saw Brent grabbing Kieran by the collar, and the next moment, a loud slap echoed through the room. Kieran's cheeks are turning red. Brent slapped Kieran on the cheek. Brent's eyes were sharp, and his usually gentle face looked demonic. Even I, who wasn't being scolded, flinched in fear. Kieran, shocked, was frozen in place.
What the hell are you doing?
Kieran flinched at Brent's loud voice. The relatives who had been enjoying their drinks fell silent and turned to look at Kieran.
Do you understand what condition Emma is in?
Annie glared at Kieran with a demonic intensity. One of the relatives noticed me and offered me a seat on the sofa. Words of anger were directed at Kieran from the other family members. You said the birth was still far off, but she's about to give birth, isn't she? I thought you said she was in the stable period, someone commented. It seemed Kieran had convinced the relatives that my delivery was still far off. He had told Brent and Annie that there were no signs of labor yet, which is why my hospitalization was postponed. Disdain filled the room as everyone started looking at Kieran with contempt. Relatives with children around the twins' age expressed their disbelief. Women were saying things like, "I can't believe this. If I were in her shoes, it would be unforgivable. What a terrible husband." There were also apologetic voices saying they were sorry for not knowing, feeling deceived by Kieran. The atmosphere was far from festive, resembling more of a funeral. Unable to withstand the mood, Kieran started making strained excuses.
She's always making excuses about taking care of the twins or being pregnant, or saying it's too close to the delivery to do any housework.
Everyone turned their attention to Kieran, wondering what he was trying to say.
That's why I made her prepare food for 20 people today, and even serve drinks.
I couldn't make sense of his words. And I'm sure everyone else was even more bewildered. Yet, Kieran continued.
She hasn't done anything up until now. This is hardly enough to make up for it.
The revelation that he made me cook for 20 people caused an uproar among the guests. Kieran, faced with their condemnation, began to sweat. A female relative suggested they disband immediately, and people started to clean up. The twins' crying could be heard from the back. Brent and Annie went to check on them. Tommy, who has a child about the same age as the twins, looked at Kieran with disdain.
That's despicable,
Tommy murmured quietly. Kieran was belittled by everyone as both a husband and a father, shrinking smaller in their presence. His usually assertive and arrogant demeanor was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my belly. The intervals between the pains seemed to be getting shorter. It was likely that labor has started. I tried to speak to Kieran, who was being scolded and had shrunk down. But he was unresponsive in shock. Someone asked if they should call the hospital for me, and I nodded slightly. Another person handed me a phone. And when I called the hospital, they told me to come in immediately. I announced to everyone that I was heading to the hospital and tried to stand up, but I couldn't get up. Tommy suggested calling an ambulance, and at that, Kieran finally reacted.
If you're calling an ambulance, tell them not to use the siren. It'd be embarrassing if the neighbors found out.
I couldn't believe Kieran was more concerned about appearances than my condition. Amidst the stunned silence of everyone, Kieran continued.
If you're going, go by yourself.
It's your fault the mood was killed anyway. It wasn't my fault at all, it was due to Kieran's lies. Everyone must be thinking the same. Amid the astonishment of everyone present, another loud sound was heard. Before anyone realized, Annie, who had returned, slapped Kieran on the cheek. Kieran clutched his face, tears welling up in his eyes.
I never thought you could be so morally corrupt. Giving birth is a matter of life and death.
Standing behind Annie, Brent was holding the twins, one in each arm.
The pain Emma has endured is nothing compared to this.
Brent, too, seemed furious, his arms trembling as he carefully placed the twins on the floor.
It's not my fault. I'm the one providing for everyone here.
Kieran insisted that I was to blame for embarrassing him in front of everyone and that he was faultless. Even in such a moment, Kieran's sense of elitism was evident. Naturally, no one sympathized with Kieran. Myself, Caitlin offered to drive since she hadn't been drinking, raising her hand. The room erupted in cheers. The decision was made for Caitlin to drive our car, and everyone quickly started moving. Some to fetch my hospital bag from the bedroom, as directed by Annie, and others to tidy up, with Brent collecting the empty dishes. Kieran alone, rubbing his slapped cheek, was fuming, muttering that if it weren't for Dad and Mom, he'd be pressing charges. Perhaps embarrassed and his pride wounded, Kieran's face turned beet red. Moreover, even his ears turned red, indicating he must have felt quite humiliated. The commotion woke the twins, who started crying loudly. With the women busy tidying up, the men took turns trying to soothe the twins. Kieran didn't lift a finger to help. And everyone else seemed to have given up on him. At that moment, I felt utterly fed up with Kieran. I honestly thought I no longer needed such a useless partner. It was Tommy who stepped in to entertain the twins, saying he often played with his own kids and started playing with them. He said that he's used to playing with his kids at home, so you can leave it to me. With that, he started playing with the twins. With support, I stood up and informed him that there were toys in the children's room and that the kids had no food allergies. I also told them to feel free to use any food from the fridge. Kieran kept muttering to himself that he wasn't wrong until the end, but I ignored him and headed for the entrance. Caitlin then drove me to the hospital in our car. Upon arrival, a nurse immediately called for a doctor, who took me to the delivery room. It seemed I was close to giving birth, given the intervals of my contractions. Sure enough, as soon as I was on the delivery table, I gave birth. It was a relief that it was an easy delivery. However, the one who I truly felt sorry for was Caitlin. Unable to leave, she ended up having to stay until the next morning. The day after I safely gave birth, Annie and Brent came to the hospital with the twins. After the incident, Kieran had sulked in a corner of the room, drinking beer from a can. Brent took Kieran to the bedroom, not wanting the children to see their father being scolded. Out of the twins' hearing, Brent reportedly scolded Kieran all night long. Kieran seemed to have lost all his spirit. Brent shared yesterday's events with a wry smile. Eventually, Kieran came to my hospital room. In front of Brent and Annie, he was meek and quietly apologized for his actions the day before. The impact of being hit by both Brent and Annie seemed to have deeply affected him. They kindly left me alone with Kieran. But his attitude changed immediately.
It's your fault I got hit by Dad and Mom.
He went on to complain about my shortcomings and lack of consideration. At that point, I was utterly fed up with Kieran. I firmly decided to divorce him then. Despite the apprehension of becoming a single mother with 3 children, I knew I couldn't stay with Kieran any longer. Without hesitation, I pressed the nurse call button. A nurse came right away. And soon after, Brent and Annie returned to the room, wondering what was happening.
This man is a stranger to me.
Please ask him to leave. The nurse looked bewildered, but Annie seemed to understand. She promptly escorted Kieran out of the room. With Kieran in tow, Brent and Annie left the hospital. As they were leaving, they mentioned that my parents would visit in the afternoon. True to Annie's words, my parents arrived in the afternoon. I shared the events of the previous day and my decision to divorce Kieran with them. My parents initially thought Kieran had been unfaithful when they heard about the divorce from Annie. They had been under the impression that divorce always involved infidelity. They couldn't have imagined that a heavily pregnant woman was forced by her husband to prepare for and serve at a Christmas party. I took my time, explaining the circumstances to my parents intermittently. Not only did I talk about being made to prepare meals for 20 people and being forced to serve drinks, but I also shared, through tears, how hard it had been and how much I had endured up until now. As they listened, my parents cried with me. By the end of our conversation, we were all smiling through our tears. My mom gently suggested I recuperate at their home after the hospital. I was discharged without issue and have been resting at my parents' house since. Regarding the divorce, Brent and Annie agreed there was no reason to oppose it. The only one who was vehemently against it was Kieran. He tried to contact me numerous times. But I blocked his calls and informed Brent and Annie not to let him contact me. Without me to serve almost as a servant, Kieran seemed to have lost his mental stability. Living alone, he couldn't keep the house tidy, and it became cluttered with trash. At work, he vented his frustration through power harassment, nearly facing disciplinary action from HR. Despite this, his behavior persisted, extending even to clients and partners, eventually leading to his dismissal. By then, it seemed no one sympathized with him. Currently, Kieran is re-educating himself on human decency while working on the family farm. Kieran apparently often cries, saying that the home he shared with me was his oasis of peace. I heard all of this from Annie, who has been in touch with me. But for me, that home was nothing but a desert. With Brent and Annie's help, my divorce from Kieran was finalized smoothly. The house we lived in was sold, and I received the entire sum from the sale as compensation in the divorce settlement. I decided to live with my parents. I still keep in touch with Brent, Annie, and Tommy. Sometimes, the twins ask to see Caitlin and Tommy, who happily play with them. For Brent and Annie, the twins are still their grandchildren. They visit whenever they can, enjoying their time with all three kids, who affectionately call them Grandpa and Grandma. The children have also grown fond of Grandpa and Grandma. Looking back, if it weren't for that Christmas party, I might not have made it to the hospital. Kieran alone couldn't have managed both the hospital trip and caring for the twins. In a way, that incident helped me come to terms with my situation with Kieran. It's odd, but I find myself grateful to Kieran for hosting that Christmas party at our home. Life is unpredictable. I'll never forget the kindness of those who helped me during that time. With my 3 children, I aim to find even greater happiness and hope to offer help to others in return. So if you've taken painkillers, you shouldn't be in pain anymore. Vacuum the floor. He stared on the painkiller package I had just taken. I will. Please wait a little for the medicine to work. When I told him that, he sighed loudly and stood up. It's not like I was asking him to do the chores, he could have waited a bit. I was holding back my sigh, then a sharp pain shot through my back. As I fell to the floor, I saw my husband, Stephen, sitting indecently with one leg on the back of the sofa. I shocked and wondered, did he just kick me, as he laughed coldly. It's enough with the period pain excuses, just vacuum the floor now. My name is Mary, I'm 27 years old. I'm a typical housewife living with my husband, Stephen. I met Stephen when I joined the company where he worked. After graduating from college, I took a job in sales. Stephen was my mentor there. He was handsome with short hair, and his good looks and conversation skills attracted customers. In a sales job, successful individuals are those who possess extensive knowledge and information about the products they are selling, and can utilize these insights in their sales approach. Alternatively, it's said there's another type of successful salesperson is who can make the customer feeling to sign a contract. Stephen was definitely the latter. Initially, I only had respect for him as a successful salesman. But when I was struggling to make deals, Stephen reached out to me. Gradually, I began confiding in him. While we were going out and having meals together, and developed my feelings for him. Therefore, I was overjoyed when we started dating and ecstatic when he proposed.
Our married life was filled with happiness.
But there was one thing that always troubled me.
The fact that I have suffered from severe menstrual pain since my school days.
Initially, I used mild over-the-counter painkillers, but as my body got used to them, I needed stronger medication to get through my daily life. When we were dating, Stephen would adjust his plans according to my cycle and would comfort me when I complained about the pain. I thought this care would continue after marriage.
But I was wrong.
Every month, the same menstrual pain occurred. Seeing me struggle to do housework without medication, Stephen would just sigh.
This didn't just start in the last few years, get used to it.
He started saying that to me. We both work, but Stephen earns more and contributes a larger amount to our living expenses. My earnings wouldn't be enough for living both of us, so I put extra effort into housework. During my period, I would finish as much housework as I could while the painkillers were effective, then rest a bit on the sofa before resuming.
I was doing everything in order, but to Stephen, it seemed like I was just lying down and resting. No matter how much I did, he never offered a word of comfort.
Then one day, we bought a new house. We had been living in an apartment, but we purchased a larger home in case we had children. Stephen's parents love socializing and often host parties with relatives. Stephen thought it was a perfect opportunity to show off our new house and decided to invite the relatives for a party at our place.
Once he made up his mind, Stephen was quick to act. He set the date for the party and handed me a list of relatives who would be attending. The list included not only names but also ages and food preferences.
To my surprise, Stephen,
"Make sure to prepare dishes that cater to everyone's preferences. I won't forgive any shortcuts like buying ready-made appetizers," he said in an annoyed tone.
It was challenging to plan the menu as everyone had different likes and dislikes, and some favorite foods of one person were disliked by another. After days of sleepless nights for planning the menu, my period started behind than I expected. I took painkillers, finished cleaning the rooms, and decorated them with flowers the day before. I placed air fresheners and repeatedly went over the next day's party steps in my mind.
Then that night, after preparing the menu, finally I went to bed. While I was preparing with the help of painkillers, Stephen had daily evening drinking and laughing loudly at the TV. I remembered Stephen like that as I fell asleep in bed.
The next morning, I got up before Stephen to make breakfast and started cooking for the party while tidying up. I was checking the time constantly and kept moving. I arranged the finished dishes on the table and carefully checked every area, from the entrance to the living room and the bathroom.
But it seemed the effect of the painkillers was wearing off, as I could no longer to bear the gradually intensifying pain, so sat down on the sofa. I wanted to lie down, but since I had managed to do my hair and makeup nicely, and didn't know when the relatives would arrive, I decided to just sit. As I turned my gaze towards Stephen, he was watching TV, a glass of alcohol in hand. Despite the fact that relatives were about to arrive, I wanted to say "don't start drinking now" to Stephen, but the words wouldn't come out.
Noticing my gaze, Stephen glared at me.
"What, you're giving me that 'don't drink at this time' look?" "It's not that. I'm getting nervous too. And you're just lounging on the sofa. You finished the preparations, right?"
Stephen put his glass on the table and walked towards me.
I felt a strange tension in his stare, a bad feeling growing inside me. Everything is in order. But my period started and the painkiller's effect is wearing off, so I'm taking a short break. I'll get moving soon.
Stephen sighed and glared at me.
"Don't coddle yourself over a mere stomachache. My mom never did that."
Right after those words, just as I thought Stephen had come up behind me, I was suddenly kicked in my back and fell off the sofa to the floor. By the time I realized that I had been kicked by someone, I was already on the floor, and it took me a while to grasp what had happened.
Meanwhile, Stephen sat down on the sofa nonchalantly. And, unbelievably, he started playing games on his mobile phone. I couldn't understand what was happening or the situation I was in. All I knew was that Stephen, without a single word of apology, was laughing and enjoying his game.
When I tried to stand up, suddenly Stephen fell to the floor. Looking up to see why he fell, I saw Stephen's dad, Paul. He was standing behind the sofa.
Paul looked furious, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. "What's going on?"
Stephen couldn't be understanding the situation and checked the sofa in panic.
"Oh, Paul? Did you just push me?"
While Stephen was picking up his phone from the floor, and he asked Paul. "I didn't push you, I shoved you, Stephen."
"What? Why would Paul shove me?" "You fools, what do you mean for kicking someone in the back? And that someone is your wife, Stephen."
Stephen seemed a bit taken aback by Paul's anger. "I was just a bit bold because I was drinking." Stephen tried to respond, but Paul glared at him, his excuse not mitigating the situation.
"Don't blame it on the alcohol. Whatever the reason, a man should never resort to violence against a woman."
"What do you mean by reason? This is like discipline."
"Discipline?"
"Yes, she was resting on the sofa even though the preparations weren't finished. So I was teaching her that if you don't work, you don't have a rest. It's part of discipline." "Right, Mary?" Suddenly asked by Stephen. I didn't know how to respond.
I had properly finished the preparations and sat on the sofa just to rest a bit.
Should I tell the truth because I did everything correctly? As I hesitated, Paul also turned his gaze towards me.
"Mary, is what Stephen's saying true?" I couldn't find the words to reply. If I told the truth, Stephen might get scolded by Paul and spoil his mood, especially with relatives about to arrive.
I didn't want to cause any trouble for the relatives who were coming to see our new house. I was about to agree with Stephen.
"Mary, your silence is an answer, isn't it?" "Eh?"
Confused by Paul's words, then I asked back.
If what Stephen said was true, Mary would have immediately agreed. But Mary is silent. That suggests that something, or everything is not true what Stephen said.
I felt as if Paul had seen through everything. I opened my mouth to tell the truth. The preparations are already done. It's just that I am feeling a bit unwell today.
"What? It's just your period."
Stephen interrupted my words.
Unable to say it directly in front of Paul, I tried to phrase it differently, but Stephen's lack of tact brought my tears from my eyes.
"Saying you're unwell over a mere period. If the preparations are done, then say so." I thought Mary was just lazily sitting on the sofa again, not finishing the preparations. Stephen's words were final.
He didn't remember what I said earlier about almost finishing the preparations. He hadn't seen that I had been preparing since early morning, or rather, since yesterday, doing all the work myself without his help.
He wasn't aware that I had taken painkillers to manage.
He had decided to host the party here on his own and didn't help with any other preparations or cooking. A sense of injustice began to grow inside me.
Listen to this.
She's been complaining about severe menstrual pain since before we got married, but she still can't get used to the pain. Every month it's like this. My mom was never like this, right, Paul? It seems I was right to come early to help Mary since you said you would entertain us as the inconsiderate host. What? I'm inconsiderate? Not Mary? Yes, it's you! You insisted on having the party here but didn't cooperate with Mary in preparations. Had you worked together, you would have understood how hard she worked and how much she was suffering. Instead, you started drinking before guests arrived. The one who was lounging around was you, Stephen.
Stephen was clearly frightened by Paul's yelling.
I didn't want Stephen to end up regretting like I do. I tried to educate you with that feeling.
Paul pulled a chair from the dining table, sat down, and sighed heavily.
Patricia was like Mary, suffered from severe menstrual pain. Being a man, I had no knowledge about menstruation, and it wasn't an information-rich era like now. Plus, her mother used to say she was weak for not managing her condition, so I thought menstrual pain was just a lack of self-management.
Paul spoke slowly, seemingly recalling the past.
Back then, painkillers were weak.
Patricia, a housewife living with in-laws, was forced to do all the chores, even during severe menstrual pain. Then, Patricia collapsed. We rushed her to the hospital, and she was diagnosed with endometriosis, which shattered her dream of giving Stephen siblings. Stephen asked Paul in a small voice. It varies by individual, and not everyone ends up like that. But excessive endurance of menstrual pain can lead to illness, and Patricia did become ill. She faced stress from housework, childcare, inconsiderate to parents' in-laws, and an unsupportive husband, eventually leading to infertility. I blamed the era, and also her mother, but it was all wrong. I should have understood for her. We can't experience their pain, so I should have listened and accepted her reality. But I didn't, and it was my fault, blindly agreeing with her mother. I regret not knowing and still do. Patricia supported Paul's shoulder as he spoke in a somber tone. I could only eye contact to Patricia in acknowledgement, who wore a sad smile as she said, "Sorry for intruding." Paul tried hard to understand. Despite his busy work, he often helped with chores and even cut ties with his own parents. Patricia looked at Paul lovingly. It was the least I could do. I didn't want to burden Patricia anymore. I wanted us three to live happily, so I did what I had to. But cutting ties with parents is a big decision. I didn't want you to have to make such decisions, so I tried to show you my mistakes. But it seems none of it got through to you. Unable to bear the tense atmosphere, Stephen spoke in an inappropriately cheerful voice.
Paul, you're exaggerating. In my memory, Mom was sick in bed, but I don't remember her being bedridden due to her period. Maybe you're just remembering it as worse than it was?
Patricia's hand on Paul's shoulder trembled slightly. Gently stroking her hand, Paul glared at Stephen. You just forgot. Patricia didn't want to worry you and tried to hide it as much as possible. If pain were just a matter of willpower, it wouldn't lead to illness. But virtually, Patricia did suffer from menstrual pain and had to lie in bed. I remember you coming home from school and complaining about her always sleeping. I even talked to you about it, explaining it wasn't laziness but a health issue. You didn't care, did you? Not only did you ignore Mary, but you also never saw Patricia's struggles. Paul's words weighed heavily on Stephen, his shoulders visibly drooping. I didn't know what to say or if it was even my place to speak in such an atmosphere. Then, the doorbell rang. It was 5 minutes before the appointed time, and I hurried to answer the door, cradling my aching stomach. On the screen, relatives were visible. I quickly responded and rushed to the entrance. Opening the door, the relatives greeted us with a bouquet arranged for our new housewarming. I thanked them and led them into the living room with due respect. As the relatives entered the living room, the atmosphere was still tense between the parents-in-law and Stephen, causing the relatives to exchange glances. What happened, Paul? One of the relatives asked Paul. Thank you all for coming to celebrate Stephen's new house. Sorry for the bad atmosphere, we were just arguing. Does arguing usually mess up the sofa and cushions like this? He misunderstood Mary resting on the sofa due to poor health as laziness and pushed her off. I was scolding him for that. Hearing Paul's words, the relatives' expressions turned to disbelief, and a younger-looking woman came over to me. Are you okay? You must be tired from all the preparations. I shook my head in response. No, just severe menstrual pain. Just? What did you say? There's menstrual leave at work, you know. I've used it too. Everyone's pain varies, but when it's really bad, you can apply for it at work. Why can't you rest at home? She said this and turned to Stephen with momentum. What? Stephen, taken aback, was met with cold stares from the parents-in-law and the relatives. Unable to bear the scrutiny, Stephen rushed into his room. Despite Stephen's absence, no one followed him. It seemed the relatives knew about Patricia's condition and even the men showed understanding. The parents-in-law immediately came to me, apologizing for their son's behavior, while the relatives admired the new house and praised my cooking. No one blamed me, they were impressed with the food and showered me with compliments. I began to enjoy myself as the painkillers started to work. After a while, I received an email from Stephen. It said that because of me, he couldn't enjoy the gathering at all. He wrote about being scolded by Paul and having no allies among the relatives, wondering why it all had to be him. I was annoyed he chose to email rather than call. As I contemplated how to respond, Patricia glanced at my phone. Seeing the message, and she stood up. Paul was seeing that, then asked, "What's going on?" Patricia snatched the mobile phone from me and handed it to Paul. When Paul looked at the phone, he also stood up, just like Patricia had.
He still hasn't understood anything. It seems I need to take him home and re-educate him from the basics.
Although unexpected, Paul and Patricia said this, looking at each other. Later, the relatives also agreed with the idea of re-educating Stephen, and they seemed fully committed to it. After a while, sensing the atmosphere, the relatives tactfully left, and Patricia went to Stephen's room and dragging him out. Both Paul and Patricia took Stephen by the arm, and he was led away without a chance to protest. About a week later, Stephen was taken back to his parents' house. I received an email from him. According to it, he mentioned that Patricia was making him extensively study about the female body and the difficulties of menstrual pain. He was being made to do household chores under Paul's supervision, assuming Patricia was in pain. The email sounded like complaints about balancing work and housework. I laughed when reading it. Thinking about how Paul and Patricia had said they would re-educate him from the basics, and it was really happening. I wondered if Stephen now understood a bit of my feelings, which made me smile. During this time, I took the opportunity to focus on my menstrual health. Following the relatives' advice that severe menstrual pain should be checked by a gynecologist, I visited the hospital while Stephen was away. Because of the advice on medication, daily routines, and precautions was helpful. Life without Stephen's comments was surprisingly comfortable.
I could live at my own pace and lie on the sofa when I felt tired.
It felt like a life where I could take care of myself. I somewhat hoped for more time like this. Partly due to Patricia's intervention, I enjoyed this slow-paced life and didn't reply to Stephen's emails. Few weeks later, when Stephen returned with his parents. The parents-in-law, who came straight to the dining table, made Stephen sit in a chair in front of them and pulled out a green paper from an envelope. It turned out to be a divorce application. I thought, could this really be a divorce right here and now? But Stephen was filling in the necessary information with a pen. Stephen began filling it out, and when he finished, Paul spoke solemnly. "Mary, if Stephen ever behaves badly towards you again, feel free to submit this signed divorce application." Paul's eyes were serious, and Stephen's too. During our separation, Stephen was apparently re-educated by his parents-in-law and promised to change his behavior. Since then, Stephen has kept his promise, not showing arrogance and even willingly doing housework, especially during my period. Gradually, he stopped making derogatory comments about menstruation. Our life has become more peaceful, and I am relieved. From now on, I plan to live without overexerting myself, paying attention to my health, and taking care of myself.